Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Part 1, Chapter 1, The Early Married Life of the Morels. The Bottoms succeeded to Hell Row. Hell Row was a block of thatched, bulging cottages that stood by the brookside on Greenhill Lane. There lived the colliers who worked in the little gin pits 2 fields away. The brook ran under the alder trees, scarcely soiled by these small mines, whose coal was drawn to the surface by donkeys that plodded wearily in a circle round a gin. And all over the countryside were these same pits, some of which had been worked in the time of Charles II, the few colliers and the donkeys burrowing down like ants into the earth, making queer mounds and little black places among the cornfields and the meadows. And the cottages of these coal miners, in blocks and pairs here and there, together with odd farms and homes of the stockingers straying over the parish, formed the village of Bestwood. Then, some 60 years ago, a sudden change took place. The gin pits were elbowed aside by the large mines of the financiers. The coal and iron field of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire was discovered. Carston, Wade & Company appeared. Amid tremendous excitement, Lord Palmerston formally opened the company's first mine at Spinney Park, on the edge of Sherwood Forest. About this time the notorious Hell Row, which through growing old had acquired an evil reputation, was burned down, and much dirt was cleansed away. Carston, Wade & Company found they had struck on a good thing, so, down the valleys of the brooks from Selby and Nuttall, new mines were sunk, until soon there were 6 pits working. From Nuttall, high up on the sandstone among the woods, the railway ran, past the ruined priory of the Carthusians, and past Robin Hood's Well, down to Spinney Park, then on to Minton, a large mine among cornfields. From Minton, across the farmlands of the valley side to Bunker's Hill, branching off there and running north to Beggarly and Selby, that looks over at Critch and the hills of Derbyshire. 6 mines like black studs on the countryside, linked by a loop of fine chain, the railway. To accommodate the regiments of miners, Carston, Wade & Company built the squares, great quadrangles of dwellings on the hillside of Bestwood, and then, in the brook valley, on the side of Hell Row, they erected the Bottoms. The Bottoms consisted of 6 blocks of miners' dwellings, 2 rows of 3, like the dots on a blank 6 domino, and 12 houses in a block. This double row of dwellings sat at the foot of the rather sharp slope from Bestwood, and looked out, from the attic windows at least, on the slow climb of the valley towards Selby. The houses themselves were substantial and very decent. One could walk all round, seeing little front gardens with auriculas and saxifrage in the shadow of the bottom block, sweet williams and pinks in the sunny top block, seeing neat front windows, little porches, little privet hedges, and dormer windows for the attics. But that was outside. That was the view on to the uninhabited parlours of all the colliers' wives. The dwelling-room, the kitchen, was at the back of the house, facing inward between the blocks, looking at a scrubby back garden, and then at the ash-pits. And between the rows, between the long lines of ash-pits, went the alley, where the children played and the women gossiped and the men smoked. So the actual conditions of living in the Bottoms, that was so well built and that looked so nice, were quite unsavoury, because people must live in the kitchen, and the kitchens open on to that nasty alley of ash-pits. Mrs. Morel was not anxious to move into the Bottoms, which was already 12 years old and on the downward path, when she descended to it from Bestwood. But it was the best she could do. Moreover, she had an end-house in one of the top blocks, and thus had only one neighbour. On the other side an extra strip of garden. And, having an end-house, she enjoyed a kind of aristocracy among the other women of the between houses, because her rent was 5 shillings and 6pence instead of 5 shillings a week. But this superiority in station was not much consolation to Mrs. Morel. She was 31 years old, and had been married 8 years. A rather small woman, of delicate mould but resolute bearing, she shrank a little from the first contact with the Bottoms women. She came down in the July, and in the September expected her third baby. Her husband was a miner. They had only been in their new home 3 weeks when the wakes, or fair, began. Morel, she knew, was sure to make a holiday of it. He went off early on the Monday morning, the day of the fair. The 2 children were highly excited. William, a boy of 7, fled off immediately after breakfast to prowl round the wakes ground, leaving Annie, who was only 5, to whine all morning to go also. Mrs. Morel did her work. She scarcely knew her neighbours yet, and knew no one with whom to trust the little girl, so she promised to take her to the wakes after dinner. William appeared at 12:30. He was a very active lad, fair-haired, freckled, with a touch of the Dane or Norwegian about him. "Can I have my dinner, mother?" he cried, rushing in with his cap on. "'Cause it begins at 1:30, the men says so." "You can have your dinner as soon as it's done," replied the mother. "Isn't it done?" he cried, his blue eyes staring at her in indignation. "Then I'm going be out it." "You'll do nothing of the sort. It will be done in 5 minutes. It is only 12:30. "They'll be beginning," the boy half cried, half shouted. "You won't die if they do," said the mother. "Besides, it's only 12:30, and you've a full hour." The lad began hastily to lay the table, and directly the 3 sat down. They were eating batter pudding and jam, when the boy jumped off his chair and stood perfectly still. Some distance away could be heard the first small braying of a merry-go-round and the tooting of a horn. His face quivered as he looked at his mother. "I told you!" he said, running to the dresser for his cap. "Take your pudding in your hand, and it's only 1:05, so you were wrong. You haven't got your twopence," cried the mother in a breath. The boy came back, bitterly disappointed, for his twopence, then went off without a word. "I want to go, I want to go," said Annie, beginning to cry. "Well, and you shall go, whining, wizening little stick," said the mother. And later in the afternoon she trudged up the hill under the tall hedge with her child. The hay was gathered from the fields, and cattle were turned on to the eddish. It was warm, peaceful. Mrs. Morel did not like the wakes. There were 2 sets of horses, one going by steam, one pulled round by a pony. 3 organs were grinding, and there came odd cracks of pistol shots, fearful screeching of the cocoanut man's rattle, shouts of the Aunt Sally man, screeches from the peep-show lady. The mother perceived her son gazing enraptured outside the Lion Wallace booth, at the pictures of this famous lion that had killed a negro and maimed for life 2 white men. She left him alone, and went to get Annie a spin of toffee. Presently the lad stood in front of her, wildly excited. "You never said you was comin'. Isn't there a lot of things? That lion's killed 3 men. I've spent my twopence, and look here." He pulled from his pocket 2 egg cups with pink moss roses on them. "I got these from that stall where you have to get the marbles in them holes, and I got these 2 in 2 goes. Halfpenny a go. They got moss roses on. Look here. I wanted these." She knew he wanted them for her. She said, pleased. "They are pretty." "Shall you carry 'em? 'Cause I'm frightened of breaking 'em." He was tip-full of excitement now she had come, led her about the ground, showed her everything. Then, at the peep-show, she explained the pictures, in a sort of story, to which he listened as if spellbound. He would not leave her. All the time he stuck close to her, bristling with a small boy's pride of her. For no other woman looked like such a lady as she did, in her little black bonnet and her cloak. She smiled when she saw women she knew. When she was tired, she said to her son, "Well, are you coming now or later?" "Are you going already?" he cried, his face full of reproach. "Already? It is past 4, I know." "What are you going already for?" he lamented. "You needn't come if you don't want," she said. and she went slowly away with her little girl, whilst her son stood watching her, cut to the heart to let her go, and yet unable to leave the wakes. As she crossed the open ground in front of the Moon and Stars, she heard men shouting, and smelled the beer, and hurried a little, thinking her husband was probably in the bar. At about 6:30 her son came home, tired now, rather pale, and somewhat wretched. He was miserable, though he did not know it, because he had let her go alone. Since she had gone he had not enjoyed his wakes. "Has my dad been?" he asked. "No," said the mother. "He's helping to wait at the Moon and Stars. I seed him through that black tin stuff with holes in it, on the window, with his sleeves rolled up." "Ha!" exclaimed the mother shortly. "He's got no money, and he'll be satisfied if he gets his allowance, whether they give him more or not." When the light was fading, and Mrs. Morel could see no more to sew, she rose and went to the door. Everywhere was the sound of excitement, the restlessness of the holiday, that at last infected her. She went out into the side garden. Women were coming home from the wakes, the children hugging a white lamb with green legs, or a wooden horse. Occasionally a man lurched past, almost as full as he could carry. Sometimes a good husband came along with his family, peacefully. But usually the women and children were alone. The stay-at-home mothers stood gossiping at the corners of the alley, as the twilight sank, folding their arms under their white aprons. Mrs. Morel was alone, but she was used to it. Her son and her little girl slept upstairs, so, it seemed, her home was there behind her, fixed and stable. But she felt wretched with the coming child. The world seemed a dreary place, where nothing else would happen for her, at least until William grew up. But for herself, nothing but this dreary endurance, till the children grew up. And the children! She could not afford to have this third. She did not want it. The father was serving beer in a public-house, swilling himself drunk. She despised him, and was tied to him. This coming child was too much for her. If it was not for William and Annie, she was sick of it, the struggle with poverty and ugliness and meanness. She went into the front garden, feeling too heavy to take herself out, yet unable to stay indoors. The heat suffocated her, and looking ahead, the prospect of her life made her feel as if she were buried alive. The front garden was a small square with a privet hedge. There she stood, trying to soothe herself with the scent of flowers and the fading, beautiful evening. Opposite her small gate was the stile that led uphill, under the tall hedge between the burning glow of the cut pastures. The sky overhead throbbed and pulsed with light. The glow sank quickly off the field. The earth and the hedges smoked dusk. As it grew dark, a ruddy glare came out on the hilltop, and out of the glare the diminished commotion of the fair. Sometimes, down the trough of darkness formed by the path under the hedges, men came lurching home. One young man lapsed into a run down the steep bit that ended the hill, and went with a crash into the stile. Mrs. Morel shuddered. He picked himself up, swearing viciously, rather pathetically, as if he thought the stile had wanted to hurt him. She went indoors, wondering if things were ever going to alter. She was beginning by now to realize that they would not. She seemed so far away from her girlhood, she wondered if it were the same person walking heavily up the back garden at the Bottoms, as had run so lightly up the breakwater at Sheerness 10 years before. "What have I to do with it?" she said to herself. "What have I to do with all this? Even the child I'm going to have. It doesn't seem as if I were taken into account." Sometimes life takes hold of one, carries the body along, accomplishes one's history, and yet is not real, but leaves oneself, as it were, slurred over. "I wait," Mrs. Morel said to herself. "I wait, and what I wait for can never come." Then she straightened the kitchen, lit the lamp, mended the fire, looked out the washing for the next day, and put it to soak. after which she sat down to her sewing. Through the long hours her needle flashed regularly through the stuff. Occasionally she sighed, moving to relieve herself, and all the time she was thinking how to make the most of what she had for the children's sakes. At 11:30 her husband came. His cheeks were very red and very shiny above his black mustache. His head nodded slightly. He was pleased with himself. Waitin' for me, lass? I've been helpin' Anthony, and what's think he gi'n me? Naught but a lousy £1/2, and that's ivery penny." "He thinks you've made the rest up in beer," she said shortly. "And I haven't, that I haven't. You believe me, I've had very little this day. I haven't all." His voice went tender. "Here, and I brought thee a bit of brandy snap, and a cocoanut for the children." He laid the gingerbread and the cocoanut, a hairy object, on the table. "Nay, tha never said thank you for naught in thy life, did there?" As a compromise, she picked up the cocoanut and shook it to see if it had any milk. "It's a good un. You may back your life for that. I got it for Bill Hodgkinson. 'Bill,' I says, 'thou done wants them 3 nuts, dost ter? Are in it to forgive me one for my bit of a lad and wench?' 'I am, Walter, my lad,' he says. 'Take which on 'em's ter a mind.' And so I took one, and thanked him. I didn't like to shake it afore his eyes, but he says, 'Tha'd better make sure it's a good un, Walt.' And so, you see, I knowed it was. He's a fine chap, is Bill Hodgkinson. He's a nice chap." "A man will part with anything so long as he's drunk, and you're drunk along with him," said Mrs. Morel. "Eh, that mucky little hussy, who's drunk, I should like to know?" said Morel. He was extraordinarily pleased with himself because of his day's helping to wait in the Moon and Stars. He chattered on. Mrs. Morel, very tired, and sick of his babble, went to bed as quickly as possible, while he raked the fire. Mrs. Morel came of a good old burgher family, famous independents who had fought with Colonel Hutchinson, and who remained stout Congregationalists. Her grandfather had gone bankrupt in the lace market at a time when so many lace manufacturers were ruined in Nottingham. Her father, George Coppard, was an engineer, a large, handsome, haughty man, proud of his fair skin and blue eyes, but more proud still of his integrity. Gertrude resembled her mother in her small build, but her temper, proud and unyielding, she had from the Coppards. George Coppard was bitterly galled by his own poverty. He became foreman of the engineers in the dockyard at Sheerness. Mrs. Morel, Gertrude, was the second daughter. She favoured her mother, loved her mother best of all, but she had the Coppards' clear, defiant blue eyes and their broad brow. She remembered to have hated her father's overbearing manner towards her gentle, humorous, kindly-souled mother. She remembered running over the breakwater at Sheerness and finding the boat. She remembered to have been petted and flattered by all the men when she had gone to the dockyard, for she was a delicate, rather proud child. She remembered the funny old mistress, whose assistant she had become, whom she had loved to help in the private school, and she still had the Bible that John Field had given her. She used to walk home from chapel with John Field when she was 19. He was the son of a well-to-do tradesman, had been to college in London, and was to devote himself to business. She could always recall in detail a September Sunday afternoon when they had sat under the vine at the back of her father's house. The sun came through the chinks of the vine leaves and made beautiful patterns, like a lace scarf, falling on her and on him. Some of the leaves were clean yellow, like yellow flat flowers. "Now sit still," he had cried. "How your hair, I don't know what it is like. It's as bright as copper and gold, as red as burnt copper, and it has gold threads where the sun shines on it. Fancy their saying it's brown. Your mother calls it mouse colour." She had met his brilliant eyes, but her clear face scarcely showed the elation which rose within her. "But you say you don't like business," she pursued. "I don't. I hate it," he cried hotly. "And you would like to go into the ministry," she half implored. I should love it if I thought I could make a first-rate preacher." "Then why don't you? Why don't you?" Her voice rang with defiance. "If I were a man, nothing would stop me." She held her head erect. He was rather timid before her. "But my father's so stiff-necked. He means to put me into the business, and I know he'll do it." "But if you're a man?" she had cried. "Being a man isn't everything," he replied, frowning with puzzled helplessness. Now, as she moved about her work at the Bottoms, with some experience of what being a man meant, she knew that it was not everything. At 20, owing to her health, she had left Sheerness. Her father had retired home to Nottingham. John Field's father had been ruined. The son had gone as a teacher in Norwood. She did not hear of him until, 2 years later, she made determined inquiry. He had married his landlady, a woman of 40, a widow with property. And still Mrs. Morel preserved John Field's Bible. She did not now believe him to be, well, she understood pretty well what he might or might not have been. So she preserved his Bible, and kept his memory intact in her heart for her own sake. To her dying day, for 35 years, she did not speak of him. When she was 23 years old, she met, at a Christmas party, a young man from the Erewash Valley. Morel was then 27 years old. He was well set up, erect, and very smart. He had wavy black hair that shone again, and a vigorous black beard that had never been shaved. His cheeks were ruddy, and his red moist mouth was noticeable because he laughed so often and so heartily. He had that rare thing, a rich, ringing laugh. Gertrude Coppard had watched him, fascinated. He was so full of colour and animation, his voice ran so easily into comic grotesque, he was so ready and so pleasant with everybody. Her own father had a rich fund of humour, but it was satiric. This man's was different, soft, non-intellectual, warm, a kind of gambolling. She herself was opposite. She had a curious, receptive mind which found much pleasure and amusement in listening to other folk. She was clever in leading folk to talk. She loved ideas, and was considered very intellectual. What she liked most of all was an argument on religion or philosophy or politics with some educated man. This she did not often enjoy, so she always had people tell her about themselves, finding her pleasure so. In her person she was rather small and delicate, with a large brow, and dropping bunches of brown silk curls. Her blue eyes were very straight, honest, and searching. She had the beautiful hands of the Coppards. Her dress was always subdued. She wore dark blue silk, with a peculiar silver chain of silver scallops. This, and a heavy brooch of twisted gold, was her only ornament. She was still perfectly intact, deeply religious, and full of beautiful candour. Walter Morel seemed melted away before her. She was to the miner that thing of mystery and fascination, a lady. When she spoke to him, it was with a southern pronunciation and a purity of English which thrilled him to hear. She watched him. He danced well, as if it were natural and joyous in him to dance. His grandfather was a French refugee who had married an English barmaid, if it had been a marriage. Gertrude Coppard watched the young miner as he danced, a certain subtle exultation like glamour in his movement, and his face the flower of his body, ruddy, with tumbled black hair, and laughing alike whatever partner he bowed above. She thought him rather wonderful, never having met anyone like him. Her father was to her the type of all men, and George Coppard, proud in his bearing, handsome, and rather bitter, who preferred theology in reading, and who drew near in sympathy only to one man, the Apostle Paul, who was harsh in government and in familiarity ironic, who ignored all sensuous pleasure. He was very different from the miner. Gertrude herself was rather contemptuous of dancing. She had not the slightest inclination towards that accomplishment, and had never learned even a Roger de Coverley. She was Puritan, like her father, high-minded and really stern. Therefore the dusky, golden softness of this man's sensuous flame of life, that flowed off his flesh like the flame from a candle, not baffled and gripped into incandescence by thought and spirit as her life was, seemed to her something wonderful, beyond her. He came and bowed above her. A warmth radiated through her as if she had drunk wine. "Now do come and have this one with me," he said caressively. "It's easy, you know. I'm pining to see you dance." She had told him before she could not dance. She glanced at his humility and smiled. Her smile was very beautiful. It moved the man so that he forgot everything. "No, I won't dance," she said softly. Her words came clean and ringing. Not knowing what he was doing, he often did the right thing by instinct. He sat beside her, inclining reverentially. "But you mustn't miss your dance," she reproved. "Nay, I don't want to dance that. It's not one as I care about." "Yet you invited me to it." He laughed very heartily at this. "I never thought of that. Thou'rt not long in taking the curl out of me." It was her turn to laugh quickly. "You don't look as if you'd come much uncurled," she said. "I'm like a pig's tail. I curl because I canna help it." He laughed rather boisterously. "And you are a miner!" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, I went down when I was 10. She looked at him in wondering dismay. "When you were 10? And wasn't it very hard?" she asked. "You soon get used to it. You live like the mice, and you pop out at night to see what's going on." "It makes me feel blind," she frowned. "Like a motorwarp," he laughed. "Yah, and there's some chaps as does go round like motorwarps." He thrust his face forward in the blind, snout-like way of a mole, seeming to sniff and peer for direction. "They done, though," he protested naively. "They never seed such a way they get in. But they mun let me take thee down some time, and they can see for theyseln." She looked at him startled. This was a new tract of life suddenly opened before her. She realized the life of the miners, hundreds of them toiling below earth and coming up at evening. He seemed to her noble. He risked his life daily, and with gaiety. She looked at him with a touch of appeal in her pure humility. "Shouldn't her like it?" he asked tenderly. "'Appen not it 'ud dirty thee." She'd never been thee'd and thou'd before. The next Christmas they were married, and for 3 months she was perfectly happy. For 6 months she was very happy. He had signed the pledge, and wore the blue ribbon of a teetotaler. He was nothing if not showy. They lived, she thought, in his own house. It was small, but convenient enough, and quite nicely furnished, with solid, worthy stuff that suited her honest soul. The women, her neighbours, were rather foreign to her, and Morel's mother and sisters were apt to sneer at her ladylike ways, but she could perfectly well live by herself, as long as she had her husband close. Sometimes, when she herself wearied of love talk, she tried to open her heart seriously to him. She saw him listen deferentially, but without understanding. This killed her efforts at a finer intimacy, and she had flashes of fear. Sometimes he was restless of an evening. It was not enough for him just to be near her, she realized. She was glad when he set himself to little jobs. He was a remarkably handy man, could make or mend anything. So she would say, "I do like that coal-rake of your mother's. It is small and natty." "Dost her, my wench? Well, I made that, so I can make thee one." "What? Why, it's a steel one." "And what if it is? Thou shalt have one very similar, if not exactly same." She did not mind the mess, nor the hammering and noise. He was busy and happy. But in the 7th month, when she was brushing his Sunday coat, she felt papers in the breast pocket, and, seized with a sudden curiosity, took them out to read. He very rarely wore the frock coat he was married in, and it had not occurred to her before to feel curious concerning the papers. They were the bills of the household furniture, still unpaid. "Look here," she said at night, after he was washed and had had his dinner. "I found these in the pocket of your wedding coat. Haven't you settled the bills yet?" "No, I haven't had a chance." "But you told me all was paid. I had better go into Nottingham on Saturday and settle them. I don't like sitting on another man's chairs and eating from an unpaid table." He did not answer. "I can have your bank book, can't I?" "Thou can have it, for what good it'll be to thee." "I thought—" she began. He had told her he had a good bit of money left over, but she realized it was no use asking questions. She sat rigid with bitterness and indignation. The next day she went down to see his mother. "Didn't you buy the furniture for Walter?" she asked. "Yes, I did," tartly retorted the elder woman. "And how much did he give you to pay for it?" The elder woman was stung with fine indignation. £80, if you're so keen on knowing," she replied. £80? But there are £42 still owing." "I can't help that." "And where has it all gone?" "You'll find all the papers, I think, if you look. Beside £10 as he owed me, and £6 is the wedding cost down here." "£6?" echoed Gertrude Morrell. It seemed to her monstrous that, after her own father had paid so heavily for her wedding, £6 more should have been squandered in eating and drinking at Walter's parents' house at his expense. "And how much has he sunk in his houses?" she asked. "His houses? Which houses?" Gertrude Morrell went white to the lips. He had told her the house he lived in, and the next one, was his own. "I thought the house we live in—" she began. "They're my houses, those two," said the mother-in-law. "And not clear, either. It's as much as I can do to keep the mortgage interest paid." Gertrude sat white and silent. She was her father now. "Then we ought to be paying you rent," she said coldly. "Walter is paying me rent," replied the mother. "And what rent?" asked Gertrude. 6 and 6 a week," retorted the mother. It was more than the house was worth. Gertrude held her head erect, looked straight before her. "It is lucky to be you," said the elder woman bitingly, "to have a husband as takes all the worry of the money and leaves you a free hand." The young wife was silent. She said very little to her husband, but her manner had changed towards him. Something in her proud, honourable soul had crystallized out, hard as rock. When October came in, she thought only of Christmas. 2 years ago, at Christmas, she had met him. Last Christmas she had married him. This Christmas she would bear him a child. "You don't dance yourself, do you, missus?" asked her nearest neighbour in October, when there was great talk of opening a dancing class over the Brick and Tile Inn at Bestwood. "No, I never had the least inclination to," Mrs. Morrell replied. "Fancy, and how funny as you should have married your Mester. You know he's quite a famous one for dancing." "I didn't know he was famous," laughed Mrs. Morrell. "Yea, he is, though. Why, he ran that dancing class in the Miners' Arms club room for over 5 year." "Did he?" "Yes, he did." The other woman was defiant. "And it was thronged every Tuesday, and Thursday, and Saturday, and there was carryings on, according to all accounts." This kind of thing was gall and bitterness to Mrs. Morrell, and she had a fair share of it. The women did not spare her at first, for she was superior, though she could not help it. He began to be rather late in coming home. "They're working very late now, aren't they?" she said to her washerwoman. "No later than they allers do, I don't think. But they stop to have their pint at Ellen's, and then they get talking, and there you are. Dinner stone cold, and it serves 'em right." "But Mr. Morel does not take any drink." The woman dropped the clothes, looked at Mrs. Morel, then went on with her work, saying nothing. End of Part 1 of Chapter 1. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 1, Part 2. The Early Married Life of the Morels. Gertrude Morel was very ill when the boy was born. Morel was good to her, as good as gold. But she felt very lonely, miles away from her own people. She felt lonely with him now, and his presence only made it more intense. The boy was small and frail at first, but he came on quickly. He was a beautiful child, with dark gold ringlets, and dark blue eyes which changed gradually to a clear gray. His mother loved him passionately. He came just when her own bitterness of disillusion was hardest to bear, when her faith in life was shaken, and her soul felt dreary and lonely. She made much of the child, and the father was jealous. At last Mrs. Morel despised her husband. She turned to the child, she turned from the father. He had begun to neglect her. The novelty of his own home was gone. He had no grit, she said bitterly to herself. What he felt just at the moment, that was all to him. He could not abide by anything. There was nothing at the back of all his show. There began a battle between the husband and wife, a fearful, bloody battle that ended only with the death of one. She fought to make him undertake his own responsibilities, to make him fulfill his obligations. But he was too different from her. His nature was purely sensuous, and she strove to make him moral, religious. She tried to force him to face things. He could not endure it. It drove him out of his mind. While the baby was still tiny, the father's temper had become so irritable that it was not to be trusted. The child had only to give a little trouble when the man began to bully. A little more, and the hard hands of the collier hit the baby. Then Mrs. Morel loathed her husband, loathed him for days, and he went out and drank, and she cared very little what he did. Only, on his return, she scathed him with her satire. The estrangement between them caused him, knowingly or unknowingly, grossly to offend her where he would not have done. William was only 1 year old, and his mother was proud of him, he was so pretty. She was not well off now, but her sisters kept the boy in clothes. Then, with his little white hat curled with an ostrich feather, and his white coat, he was a joy to her, the twining wisps of hair clustering round his head. Mrs. Morel lay listening, one Sunday morning, to the chatter of the father and child downstairs. Then she dozed off. When she came downstairs, a great fire glowed in the grate, the room was hot, the breakfast was roughly laid, and seated in his armchair against the chimney-piece sat Morel, rather timid, and standing between his legs the child, cropped like a sheep, with such an odd round poll, looking wondering at her, and on a newspaper spread out upon the hearth-rug, a myriad of crescent-shaped curls, like the petals of a marigold scattered in the reddening firelight. Mrs. Morel stood still. It was her first baby. She went very white and was unable to speak. "What dost thou think of him?" Morel laughed uneasily. She gripped her two fists, lifted them, and came forward. Morel shrank back. "I could kill you, I could," she said. She choked with rage, her two fists uplifted. "You none want to make a wench on him," Morel said in a frightened tone, bending his head to shield his eyes from her. His attempt at laughter had vanished. The mother looked down at the jagged, close-clipped head of her child. She put her hands on his hair and stroked and fondled his head. "Oh, my boy!" she faltered. Her lip trembled, her face broke, and snatching up the child she buried her face in his shoulder and cried painfully. She was one of those women who cannot cry, whom it hurt as it hurts a man. It was like ripping something out of her sobbing. Morrill sat with his elbows on his knees, his hands gripped together till the knuckles were white. He gazed in the fire, feeling almost stunned, as if he could not breathe. Presently she came to an end, soothed the child, and cleared away the breakfast table. She left the newspaper, littered with curls, spread upon the hearthrug. At last her husband gathered it up and put it at the back of the fire. She went about her work with closed mouth and very quiet. Morrill was subdued. He crept about wretchedly, and his meals were a misery that day. She spoke to him civilly, and never alluded to what he had done, but he felt something final had happened. Afterward she said she had been silly, that the boy's hair would have had to be cut sooner or later. In the end, she even brought herself to say to her husband it was just as well he had played barber when he did. But she knew, and Morrill knew, that that act had caused something momentous to take place in her soul. She remembered the scene all her life as one in which she had suffered the most intensely. This act of masculine clumsiness was the spear through the side of her love for Morrill. Before, while she had striven against him bitterly, she had fretted after him, as if he had gone astray from her. Now she ceased to fret for his love. He was an outsider to her. This made life much more bearable. Nevertheless, she still continued to strive with him. She still had her high moral sense, inherited from generations of Puritans. It was now a religious instinct, and she was almost a fanatic with him, because she loved him, or had loved him. If he sinned, she tortured him. If he drank and lied, was often a poltroon, sometimes a knave, she wielded the lash unmercifully. The pity was, she was too much his opposite. She could not be content with the little he might be. She would have him the much that he ought to be. So, in seeking to make him nobler than he could be, she destroyed him. She injured and hurt and scarred herself, but she lost none of her worth. She also had the children. He drank rather heavily, though not more than many miners, and always beer, so that whilst his health was affected, it was never injured. The week-end was his chief carouse. He sat in the miners' arms until turning-out time every Friday, every Saturday, and every Sunday evening. On Monday and Tuesday he had to get up and reluctantly leave towards 10 o'clock. Sometimes he stayed at home on Wednesday and Thursday evenings, or was only out for an hour. He practically never had to miss work owing to his drinking. But although he was very steady at work, his wages fell off. He was blab-mouthed, a tongue-wagger. Authority was hateful to him, therefore he could only abuse the pit managers. He would say, in the Palmerston, "The gaffer come down to our stall this morning, and he says, 'You know, Walter, this 'ere'll not do. What about these props?' And I says to him, 'Why, what art talking about? What do you mean about the props?' 'It'll never do, this 'ere,' he says. 'You'll be having the roof in one of these days.' And I says, 'Thou had better stand on a bit of clunch then, and hold it up with thy head.' So he wore that mad he crossed and he swore, and the other chaps they did laugh." Morrill was a good mimic. He imitated the manager's fat, squeaky voice, with its attempt at good English. "I shan't have it, Walter. Who knows more about it, me or you?" So I says, "I've never fun out how much thou knows, Alfred. It'll happen carry thee ter bed and back." So Morrill would go on to the amusement of his boon companions, and some of this would be true. The pit manager was not an educated man. He had been a boy along with Morrill, so that, while the two disliked each other, they more or less took each other for granted. But Alfred Charlesworth did not forgive the butty these public-house sayings. Consequently, although Morrill was a good miner, sometimes earning as much as £5 a week when he married, he came gradually to have worse and worse stalls, where the coal was thin and hard to get, and unprofitable. Also, in summer, the pits are slack. Often, on bright sunny mornings, the men are seen trooping home again at 10, 11, or 12 o'clock. No empty trucks stand at the pit mouth. The women on the hillside look across as they shake the hearthrug against the fence, and count the wagons the engine is taking along the line up the valley. And the children, as they come from school at dinner-time, looking down the fields and seeing the wheels on the headstocks standing, say, "Minton's knocked off. My dad'll be at home." And there is a sort of shadow over all, women and children and men, because money will be short at the end of the week. Morrill was supposed to give his wife 30 shillings a week to provide everything: rent, food, clothes, clubs, insurance, doctors. Occasionally, if he were flush, he gave her 35. But these occasions by no means balanced those when he gave her 25. In winter, with a decent stall, the miner might earn 50 or 55 shillings a week. Then he was happy. On Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday, he spent royally, getting rid of his sovereign or thereabouts. And out of so much he scarcely spared the children an extra penny or bought them a pound of apples. It all went in drink. In the bad times, matters were more worrying, but he was not so often drunk, so that Mrs. Morrill used to say, "I'm not sure I wouldn't rather be short, for when he's flush there isn't a minute of peace." If he earned 40 shillings he kept 10, from 35 he kept 5, from 32 he kept 4, from 28 he kept 3, from 24 he kept 2, from 20 he kept 1 and 6, from 18 he kept a shilling, from 16 he kept 6pence. He never saved a penny, and he gave his wife no opportunity of saving. Instead, she had occasionally to pay his debts, not public-house debts, for those never were passed on to the women, but debts when he had bought a canary or a fancy walking-stick. At the Wakes time Morrill was working badly, and Mrs. Morrill was trying to save against her confinement. So it galled her bitterly to think he should be out taking his pleasure and spending money, whilst she remained at home harassed. There were 2 days' holiday. On the Tuesday morning Morrill rose early. He was in good spirits. Quite early, before 6 o'clock, she heard him whistling away to himself downstairs. He had a pleasant way of whistling, lively and musical. He nearly always whistled hymns. He had been a choir boy with a beautiful voice, and had taken solos in Southwell Cathedral. His morning whistling alone betrayed it. His wife lay listening to him tinkering away in the garden, his whistling ringing out as he sawed and hammered away. It always gave her a sense of warmth and peace to hear him thus as she lay in bed, the children not yet awake, in the bright early morning, happy in his man's fashion. At 9 o'clock, while the children with bare legs and feet were sitting playing on the sofa, and the mother was washing up, he came in from his carpentry, his sleeves rolled up, his waistcoat hanging open. He was still a good-looking man, with black, wavy hair and a large black moustache. His face was perhaps too much inflamed, and there was about him a look almost of peevishness. But now he was jolly. He went straight to the sink where his wife was washing up. "What, are thee there?" he said boisterously. "Sleuth off and let me wash mysel'." "You may wait until I've finished," said his wife. "Oh, mayn't I? And what if I shouldna?" This good-humoured threat amused Mrs. Morrill. "Then you can go and wash yourself in the soft water tub." "Ha! I canna thou mucky little hussy." With which he stood watching her a moment, then went away to wait for her. When he chose, he could make himself again a real gallant. Usually he preferred to go out with a scarf round his neck. Now, however, he made a toilette. There seemed so much gusto in the way he puffed and swilled as he washed himself, so much alacrity with which he hurried to the mirror in the kitchen, and bending because it was too low for him, scrupulously parted his wet black hair, that it irritated Mrs. Morrill. He put on a turned-down collar, a black bow, and wore his Sunday tail-coat. As such, he looked spruce, and what his clothes would not do, his instinct for making the most of his good looks would. At 9:30, Jerry Purdy came to call for his pal. Jerry was Morel's bosom friend, and Mrs. Morel disliked him. He was a tall, thin man with a rather foxy face, the kind of face that seems to lack eyelashes. He walked with a stiff, brittle dignity, as if his head were on a wooden spring. His nature was cold and shrewd. Generous where he intended to be generous, he seemed to be very fond of Morel and more or less to take charge of him. Mrs. Morel hated him. She had known his wife, who had died of consumption, and who had, at the end, conceived such a violent dislike of her husband that if he came into her room it caused her hemorrhage. None of which Jerry had seemed to mind. And now his eldest daughter, a girl of 15, kept a poor house for him and looked after the 2 younger children. "A mean, wizen-hearted stick," Mrs. Morel said of him. "I've never known Jerry mean in my life," protested Morel. "An opener-handed and more freer chap you couldn't find anywhere, according to my knowledge." "Open-handed to you," retorted Mrs. Morel, "but his fist is shut tight enough to his children, poor things." "Poor things! And what for are they poor things, I should like to know?" But Mrs. Morel would not be appeased on Jerry's score. The subject of argument was seen, craning his thin neck over the scullery curtain. He caught Mrs. Morel's eye. "Mornin', missus. Mister in?" "Yes, he is." Jerry entered unasked, and stood by the kitchen doorway. He was not invited to sit down, but stood there, coolly asserting the rights of men and husbands. "A nice day," he said to Mrs. Morel. "Yes." "Grand out this morning. Grand for a walk." "Do you mean you're going for a walk?" she asked. "Yes, we mean walking to Nottingham," he replied. "Hmm." The 2 men greeted each other, both glad. Jerry, however, full of assurance, Morel rather subdued, afraid to seem too jubilant in presence of his wife. But he laced his boots quickly, with spirit. They were going for a 10-mile walk across the fields to Nottingham. Climbing the hillside from the bottoms, they mounted gaily into the morning. At the Moon and Stars they had their first drink, then on to the old spot. Then a long 5 miles of drought to carry them into Bulwell to a glorious pint of bitter. But they stayed in a field with some haymakers whose gallon bottle was full, so that, when they came in sight of the city, Morel was sleepy. The town spread upwards before them, smoking vaguely in the midday glare, fridging the crest away to the south with spires and factory bulks and chimneys. In the last field Morel lay down under an oak tree and slept soundly for over an hour. When he rose to go forward, he felt queer. The 2 had dinner in the meadows with Jerry's sister, then repaired to the punch bowl, where they mixed in the excitement of pigeon racing. Morel never in his life played cards, considering them as having some occult, malevolent power. "The devil's pictures," he called them. But he was a master of skittles and of dominoes. He took a challenge from a Newark man on skittles. All the men in the old, long bar took sides, betting either one way or the other. Morel took off his coat. Jerry held the hat containing the money. The men at the tables watched. Some stood with their mugs in their hands. Morel felt his big wooden ball carefully, then launched it. He played havoc among the ninepins, and won half a crown, which restored him to solvency. By 7 o'clock the 2 were in good condition. They caught the 7:30 train home. In the afternoon the Bottoms was intolerable. Every inhabitant remaining was out of doors. The women, in 2s and 3s, bareheaded and in white aprons, gossiped in the alley between the blocks. Men, having a rest between drinks, sat on their heels and talked. The place smelled stale. The slate roofs glistered in the arid heat. Mrs. Morel took the little girl down to the brook in the meadows, which were not more than 200 yards away. The water ran quickly over stones and broken pots. Mother and child leaned on the rail of the old sheep bridge, watching. Up at the dipping hole at the other end of the meadow, Mrs. Morel could see the naked forms of boys flashing round the deep yellow water, or an occasional bright figure dart glittering over the blackish stagnant meadow. She knew William was at the dipping hole, and it was the dread of her life lest he should get drowned. Annie played under the tall old hedge, picking up alder cones that she called currants. The child required much attention, and the flies were teasing. The children were put to bed at 7 o'clock. Then she worked a while. When Walter Morel and Jerry arrived at Bestwood, they felt a load off their minds. A railway journey no longer impended, so they could put the finishing touches to a glorious day. They entered the Nelson with the satisfaction of returned travellers. The next day was a work day, and the thought of it put a damper on the men's spirits. Most of them, moreover, had spent their money. Some were already rolling dismally home to sleep in preparation for the morrow. Mrs. Morel, listening to their mournful singing, went indoors. 9 o'clock passed, and 10, and still the pair had not returned. On a doorstep somewhere a man was singing loudly in a drawl, "Lead, kindly light." Mrs. Morel was always indignant with the drunken men that they must sing that hymn when they got maudlin. "As if Genevieve wasn't good enough," she said. The kitchen was full of the scent of boiled herbs and hops. On the hob, a large black saucepan steamed slowly. Mrs. Morel took a panchion, a great bowl of thick red earth, streamed a heap of white sugar into the bottom, and then, straining herself to the weight, was pouring in the liquor. Just then Morel came in. He had been very jolly in the Nelson, and coming home had grown irritable. He had not quite got over the feeling of irritability and pain, after having slept on the ground when he was so hot, and a bad conscience afflicted him as he neared the house. He did not know he was angry, but when the garden gate resisted his attempts to open it, he kicked it and broke the latch. He entered just as Mrs. Morel was pouring the infusion of herbs out of the saucepan. Swaying slightly, he lurched against the table. The boiling liquor pitched. Mrs. Morel started back. "Good gracious!" she cried. "Coming home in his drunkenness!" "Coming home in his what?" he snarled, his hat over his eye. Suddenly her blood rose in a jet. "Say you're not drunk!" she flashed. She had put down her saucepan and was stirring the sugar into the beer. He dropped his two hands heavily on the table, and thrust his face forwards at her. "Say you're not drunk," he repeated. "Why, nobody but a nasty little bitch like you would have such a thought." He thrust his face forward at her. "There's money to bezzle with, if there's money for nothing else." "I've not spent a 2-shilling bit this day," he said. "You don't get as drunk as a lord on nothing," she replied. "And," she cried, flashing into sudden fury, "if you've been sponging on your beloved Jerry, why, let him look after his children, for they need it." "It's a lie! It's a lie! Shut your face, woman!" They were now at battle pitch. Each forgot everything save the hatred of the other and the battle between them. She was fiery and furious as he. They went on till he called her a liar. "No!" she cried, starting up, scarce able to breathe. "Don't call me that! You, the most despicable liar that ever walked in shoe leather!" She forced the last word out of suffocated lungs. "You're a liar!" he yelled, banging the table with his fist. "You're a liar! You're a liar!" She stiffened herself with clenched fists. "The house is filthy with you!" she cried. "Then get out on it! It's mine! Get out on it!" he shouted. "It's me as brings the money home, not thee. It's my house, not thine. Then get out of it! Then get out on it!" "And I would," she cried, suddenly shaken into tears of impotence,
Ah, wouldn't I have gone long ago but for those children? Haven't I repented not going years ago, when I'd the only one? Suddenly drawing into rage. Do you think it's for you I stop? Do you think I'd stop 1 minute for you? Go then, he shouted, beside himself. Go! No! She faced round. No! She cried loudly. You shan't have it all your own way. You shan't do all you like. I've got those children to see to. My word, she laughed, I should look well to leave them to you. Go! He cried thickly, lifting his fist. He was afraid of her. Go! I should be only too glad. I should laugh, my lord, if I could get away from you, she replied. He came up to her, his red face with its bloodshot eyes thrust forward, and gripped her arms. She cried in fear of him, struggled to be free. Coming slightly to himself, panting, he pushed her roughly to the outer door, and thrust her forth, slotting the bolt behind her with a bang. Then he went back into the kitchen, dropped into his armchair, his head, bursting full of blood, sinking between his knees. Thus he dipped gradually into a stupor, from exhaustion and intoxication. The moon was high and magnificent in the August night. Mrs. Morel, seared with passion, shivered to find herself out there in a great white light that fell cold on her and gave a shock to her inflamed soul. She stood for a few moments helplessly staring at the glistening white rhubarb leaves near the door. Then she got the air into her breast. She walked down the garden path, trembling in every limb, while the child boiled within her. For a while she could not control her consciousness. Mechanically she went over the last scene, then over it again. Certain phrases, certain moments coming each time like a brand red-hot down on her soul. And each time she enacted again the past hour, each time the brand came down at the same points, till the mark was burnt in, and the pain burnt out, and at last she came to herself. She must have been half an hour in this delirious condition. Then the presence of the night came again to her. She glanced round in fear. She had wandered to the side garden, where she was walking up and down the path beside the currant bushes under the long wall. The garden was a narrow strip, bounded from the road, that cut transversely between the blocks by a thick thorn hedge. She hurried out of the side garden to the front, where she could stand as if in an immense gulf of white light, the moon streaming high in face of her, the moonlight standing up from the hills in front, and filling the valley where the bottoms crouched, almost blindingly. There, panting and half weeping in reaction from the stress, she murmured to herself over and over again, "The nuisance! The nuisance!" She became aware of something about her. With an effort she roused herself to see what it was that penetrated her consciousness. The tall white lilies were reeling in the moonlight, and the air was charged with their perfume, as with a presence. Mrs. Morel gasped slightly in fear. She touched the big, pallid flowers on their petals, then shivered. They seemed to be stretching in the moonlight. She put her hand into one white bin. The gold scarcely showed on her fingers by moonlight. She bent down to look at the binful of yellow pollen, but it only appeared dusky. Then she drank a deep draught of the scent. It almost made her dizzy. Mrs. Morel leaned on the garden gate, looking out, and she lost herself a while. She did not know what she thought. Except for a slight feeling of sickness and her consciousness in the child, herself melted out like scent into the shiny, pale air. After a time the child, too, melted with her in the mixing pot of moonlight, and she rested with the hills and lilies and houses, all swum together in a kind of swoon. When she came to herself she was tired for sleep. Languidly she looked about her. The clumps of white phlox seemed like bushes spread with linen. A moth ricocheted over them and right across the garden. Following it with her eye roused her. A few whiffs of the raw, strong scent of phlox invigorated her. She passed along the path, hesitating at the white rosebush. It smelled sweet and simple. She touched the white ruffles of the roses. Their fresh scent and cool, soft leaves reminded her of the morning time and sunshine. She was very fond of them. But she was tired and wanted to sleep. In the mysterious out-of-doors she felt forlorn. There was no noise anywhere. Evidently the children had not been wakened, or had gone to sleep again. A train 3 miles away roared across the valley. The night was very large and very strange, stretching its hoary distances infinitely. And out of the silvery grey fog of darkness came sounds vague and hoarse, a corncrake not far off, sound of a train like a sigh, and distant shouts of men. Her quietened heart beginning to beat quickly again, she hurried down the side garden to the back of the house. Softly she lifted the latch. The door was still bolted and hard against her. She rapped gently, waited, then rapped again. She must not rouse the children nor the neighbors. He must be asleep, and he would not wake easily. Her heart began to burn to be indoors. She clung to the door handle. Now it was cold. She would take a chill, and in her present condition. Putting her apron over her head and her arms, she hurried again to the side garden, to the window of the kitchen. Leaning on the sill, she could just see, under the blind, her husband's arms spread out on the table, and his black head on the board. He was sleeping with his face lying on the table. Something in his attitude made her feel tired of things. The lamp was burning smokily. She could tell by the copper color of the light. She tapped at the window more and more noisily. Almost it seemed as if the glass would break. Still he did not wake up. After vain efforts, she began to shiver, partly from contact with the stone, and from exhaustion. Fearful always for the unborn child, she wondered what she could do for warmth. She went down to the coal-house, where there was an old hearth-rug she had carried out for the ragman the day before. This she wrapped over her shoulders. It was warm, if grimy. Then she walked up and down the garden path, peeping every now and then under the blind, knocking, and telling herself that in the end the very strain of his position must wake him. At last, after about an hour, she rapped long and low at the window. Gradually the sound penetrated to him. When, in despair, she had ceased to tap, she saw him stir, then lift his face blindly. The labouring of his heart hurt him into consciousness. She rapped imperatively at the window. He started awake. Instantly she saw his fists set and his eyes glare. He had not a grain of physical fear. If it had been 20 burglars, he would have gone blindly for them. He glared round bewildered but prepared to fight. "Open the door, Walter," she said coldly. His hands relaxed. It dawned on him what he had done. His head dropped, sullen and dogged. She saw him hurry to the door, heard the bolt chock. He tried the latch. It opened, and there stood the silver-grey night, fearful to him after the tawny light of the lamp. He hurried back. When Mrs. Morel entered, she saw him almost running through the door to the stairs. He had ripped his collar off his neck in his haste to be gone ere she came in, and there it lay with bursted buttonholes. It made her angry. She warmed and soothed herself. In her weariness forgetting everything, she moved about at the little tasks that remained to be done, set his breakfast, rinsed his pit bottle, put his pit clothes on the hearth to warm, set his pit boots beside them, put him out a clean scarf and snap bag and 2 apples, raked the fire, and went to bed. He was already dead asleep. His narrow black eyebrows were drawn up in a sort of peevish misery into his forehead, while his cheeks' downstrokes and his sulky mouth seemed to be saying, "I don't care who you are, nor what you are. I shall have my own way." Mrs. Morel knew him too well to look at him. As she unfastened her brooch at the mirror, She smiled faintly to see her face all smeared with the yellow dust of lilies. She brushed it off, and at last lay down. For some time her mind continued snapping and jetting sparks, but she was asleep before her husband awoke from the first sleep of his drunkenness. End of chapter.
Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 2. The Birth of Paul and Another Battle. After such a scene as the last, Walter Morrell was for some days abashed and ashamed, but he soon regained his old bullying indifference. Yet there was a slight shrinking, a diminishing in his assurance. Physically even he shrank, and his fine, full presence waned. He never grew in the least stout, so that, as he sank from his erect, assertive bearing, his physique seemed to contract along with his pride and moral strength. But now he realized how hard it was for his wife to drag about at her work, and, his sympathy quickened by penitence, hastened forward with his help. He came straight home from the pit, and stayed in at evening till Friday, and then he could not remain at home. But he was back again by 10 o'clock, almost quite sober. He always made his own breakfast. Being a man who rose early, and had plenty of time, he did not, as some miners do, drag his wife out of bed at 6 o'clock. At 5, sometimes earlier, he woke, got straight out of bed, and went downstairs. When she could not sleep, his wife lay waiting for this time, as for a period of peace. The only real rest seemed to be when he was out of the house. He went downstairs in his shirt and then struggled into his pit trousers, which were left on the hearth to warm all night. There was always a fire, because Mrs. Morrell raked, and the first sound in the house was the bang, bang of the poker against the raker, as Morrell smashed the remainder of the coal to make the kettle, which was filled and left on the hob, finally boil. His cup and knife and fork, all he wanted except just the food, was laid ready on the table on a newspaper. Then he got his breakfast, made the tea, packed the bottom of the doors with rugs to shut out the draught, piled a big fire, and sat down to an hour of joy. He toasted his bacon on a fork, and caught the drops of fat on his bread. Then he put the rasher on his thick slice of bread and cut off chunks with a clasp knife, poured his tea into his saucer, and was happy. With his family about, meals were never so pleasant. He loathed a fork. It is a modern introduction which has still scarcely reached common people. What Morrell preferred was a clasp knife. Then, in solitude, he ate and drank, often sitting, in cold weather, on a little stool with his back to the warm chimney-piece, his food on the fender, his cup on the hearth. And then he read the last night's newspaper, what of it he could, spelling it over laboriously. He preferred to keep the blinds down and the candle lit even when it was daylight. It was the habit of the mine. At 5:45 he rose, cut 2 thick slices of bread and butter, and put them in the white calico snap-bag. He filled his tin bottle with tea. Cold tea without milk or sugar was the drink he preferred for the pit. Then he pulled off his shirt and put on his pit singlet, a vest of thick flannel cut low round the neck, and with short sleeves like a chemise. Then he went upstairs to his wife with a cup of tea because she was ill, and because it occurred to him. "I've brought thee a cup of tea, lass," he said. "Well, you needn't, for you know I don't like it," she replied. "Drink it up. It'll pop thee off to sleep again." She accepted the tea. It pleased him to see her take it and sip it. "I'll back my life there's no sugar in," she said. "Yai, there's one big un," he replied, injured. "It's a wonder," she said, sipping again. She had a winsome face when her hair was loose. He loved her to grumble at him in this manner. He looked at her again, and went, without any sort of leave-taking. He never took more than 2 slices of bread and butter to eat in the pit, so an apple or an orange was a treat to him. He always liked it when she put one out for him. He tied a scarf round his neck, put on his great heavy boots, his coat with the big pocket that carried his snap-bag and his bottle of tea,
and went forth into the fresh morning air, closing, without locking, the door behind him. He loved the early morning and the walk across the fields. So he appeared at the pit top, often with a stalk from the hedge between his teeth, which he chewed all day to keep his mouth moist, down the mine, feeling quite as happy as when he was in the field. Later, when the time for the baby grew nearer, he would bustle round in his slovenly fashion, poking out the ashes, rubbing the fireplace, sweeping the house before he went to work. Then, feeling very self-righteous, he went upstairs. "Now I'm cleaned up for thee. There's no 'casions for to stir a peg all day, but sit and read thy books," which made her laugh in spite of her indignation. "And the dinner cooks itself?" she answered. I know nought about the dinner." "You'd know if there wasn't any." "Aye, happen so," he answered, departing. When she got downstairs, she would find the house tidy, but dirty. She could not rest until she had thoroughly cleaned, so she went down to the ash-pit with her dustpan. Mrs. Kirk, spying her, would contrive to have to go to her own coal place at that minute. Then, across the wooden fence, she would call, "So you keep your wagon on, then?" "Aye," answered Mrs. Morel deprecatingly. "There's nothing else for it." "Have you seen Hose?" called a very small woman from across the road. It was Mrs. Anthony, a black-haired, strange little body, who always wore a brown velvet dress, tight-fitting. "I haven't," said Mrs. Morel. I wish he'd come. I've got a copper full of clothes, and I'm sure I heerd his bell." "Hark! He's at the end." The two women looked down the alley. At the end of the bottoms a man stood in a sort of old-fashioned trap, bending over bundles of cream-coloured stuff, while a cluster of women held up their arms to him, some with bundles. Mrs. Anthony herself had a heap of creamy undyed stockings hanging over her arm. "I've done 10 dozen this week," she said proudly to Mrs. Morel. "Tst!" went the other. "I don't know how you can find time." "Eh?" said Mrs. Anthony. "You can find time if you make time." "I don't know how you do it," said Mrs. Morel. "And how much shall you get for those many?" "Tuppence halfpenny the dozen," replied the other. "Well," said Mrs. Morel, "I'd starve before I'd sit down and seam 24 stockings for tuppence ha'penny." "Oh, I don't know," said Mrs. Anthony. "You can rip along with 'em." Hose was coming along, ringing his bell. Women were waiting at the yard ends with their seamed stockings hanging over their arms. The man, a common fellow, made jokes with them, tried to swindle them, and bullied them. Mrs. Morel went up her yard disdainfully. It was an understood thing that if one woman wanted her neighbour, she should put the poker in the fire and bang at the back of the fireplace, which, as the fires were back to back, would make a great noise in the adjoining house. One morning Mrs. Kirk, mixing a pudding, nearly started out of her skin as she heard the thud, thud in her grate. With her hands all floury, she rushed to the fence. "Did you knock, Mrs. Morel?" "If you wouldn't mind, Mrs. Kirk." Mrs. Kirk climbed on to her copper, got over the wall on to Mrs. Morel's copper, and ran in to her neighbour. "Eh, dear, how are you feeling?" she cried in concern. "You might fetch Mrs. Bower," said Mrs. Morel. Mrs. Kirk went into the yard, lifted up her strong, shrill voice, and called, "Aggie! Aggie!" The sound was heard from one end of the bottoms to the other. At last Aggie came running up, and was sent for Mrs. Bower, whilst Mrs. Kirk left her pudding and stayed with her neighbour. Mrs. Morel went to bed. Mrs. Kirk had Annie and William for dinner. Mrs. Bower, fat and waddling, bossed the house. "Hash some cold meat up for the master's dinner, and make him an apple charlotte pudding," said Mrs. Morel. "He may go without pudding this day," said Mrs. Bower. Morel was not as a rule one of the first to appear at the bottom of the pit, ready to come up. Some men were there before 4 o'clock, when the whistle blew loose all. But Morel, whose stall, a poor one, was at this time about 1.5 miles away from the bottom, worked usually till the first mate stopped. Then he finished also. This day, however, the miner was sick of the work. At 2 o'clock he looked at his watch, by the light of the green candle. He was in a safe working. And again at 2:30. He was hewing at a piece of rock that was in the way for the next day's work. As he sat on his heels, or kneeled, giving hard blows with his pick, "Huzzah! Huzzah!" he went. "Shelter finish, sorry?" cried Barker, his fellow butty. "Finish! Never while the world stands," growled Morel. And he went on striking. He was tired. "It's a heart-breaking job," said Barker. But Morel was too exasperated, at the end of his tether, to answer. Still he struck and hacked with all his might. "Tha might as well leave it, Walter," said Barker. "It'll do tomorrow, without thee hacking thy guts out." "I'll lay no finger on this tomorrow, Israel," cried Morel. "Oh, well, if thou wunna, somebody else'll ha' to," said Israel. Then Morel continued to strike. "Hey up there, loosa!" cried the men, leaving the next stall. Morel continued to strike. "Thou'll happen to catch me up," said Barker, departing. When he had gone, Morel, left alone, felt savage. He had not finished his job. He had overworked himself into a frenzy. Rising, wet with sweat, he threw his tool down, pulled on his coat, blew out his candle, took his lamp, and went. Down the main road the lights of the other men went swinging. There was a hollow sound of many voices. It was a long, heavy tramp underground. He sat at the bottom of the pit, where the great drops of water fell plash. Many colliers were waiting their turns to go up, talking noisily. Morel gave his answers short and disagreeable. "It's rainin', sorry," said old Giles, who had had the news from the top. Morel found one comfort. He had his old umbrella, which he loved, in the lamp cabin. At last he took his stand on the chair, and was at the top in a moment. Then he handed in his lamp and got his umbrella, which he had bought at an auction for 1 6. He stood on the edge of the pit bank for a moment, looking out over the fields. Grey rain was falling. The truck stood full of wet, bright coal. Water ran down the sides of the wagons, over the white C.W. & Company. Colliers, walking indifferent to the rain, were streaming down the line and up the field, a grey, dismal host. Morel put up his umbrella and took pleasure from the peppering of the drops thereon. All along the road to Bestwood the miners tramped, wet and grey and dirty, but their red mouths talking with animation. Morel also walked with the gang, but he said nothing. He frowned peevishly as he went. Many men passed into the Prince of Wales or into Ellen's. Morel, feeling sufficiently disagreeable to resist temptation, trudged along under the dripping trees that overhung the park wall, and down the mud of Greenhill Lane. Mrs. Morel lay in bed, listening to the rain and the feet of the colliers from Minton, their voices, and the bang-bang of the gates as they went through the stile up the field. "There's some herb beer behind the pantry door," she said. "The master'll want a drink if he doesn't stop." But he was late, so she concluded he had called for a drink, since it was raining. What did he care about the child or her? She was very ill when her children were born. "What is it?" she asked, feeling sick to death. "A boy." And she took consolation in that. The thought of being the mother of men was warming to her heart. She looked at the child. It had blue eyes and a lot of fair hair, and was bonny. Her love came up hot, in spite of everything. She had it in bed with her. Morel, thinking nothing, dragged his way up the garden path, wearily and angrily. He closed his umbrella, and stood it in the sink. Then he sluthered his heavy boots into the kitchen. Mrs. Bower appeared in the inner doorway. "Well," she said, "she's about as bad as she can be. It's a boy child." The miner grunted, put his empty snap-bag and his tin bottle on the dresser, went back into the scullery and hung up his coat, then came and dropped into his chair. "Hadn't you got a drink?" he asked. The woman went into the pantry. There was heard the pop of a cork. She set the mug with a little disgusted rap on the table before Morel. He drank, gasped, wiped his big moustache on the end of his scarf, drank, gasped, and lay back in his chair. The woman would not speak to him again. She set his dinner before him and went upstairs. "Was that the master?" asked Mrs. Morel. "I've gave him his dinner," replied Mrs. Bower. After he had sat with his arms on the table, he resented the fact that Mrs. Bower put no cloth on for him, and gave him a little plate instead of a full-sized dinner plate. He began to eat. The fact that his wife was ill, that he had another boy, was nothing to him at that moment. He was too tired. He wanted his dinner. He wanted to sit with his arms lying on the board. He did not like having Mrs. Bower about. The fire was too small to please him. After he had finished his meal, he sat for 20 minutes. Then he stoked up a big fire. Then, in his stockinged feet, he went reluctantly upstairs. It was a struggle to face his wife at this moment, and he was tired. His face was black and smeared with sweat. His singlet had dried again, soaking the dirt in. He had a dirty woolen scarf round his throat. So he stood at the foot of the bed. "Well, how art her, then?" he asked. "I should be all right," she answered. "H'm." He stood at a loss what to say next. He was tired, and this bother was rather a nuisance to him, and he didn't quite know where he was. "A lad, tha says," he stammered. She turned down the sheet and showed the child. "Bless him," he murmured, which made her laugh because he blessed by rote, pretending paternal emotion which he did not feel just then. "Go now," she said. "I will, my lass," he answered, turning away. Dismissed, he wanted to kiss her, but he dared not. She half wanted him to kiss her, but could not bring herself to give any sign. She only breathed freely when he was gone out of the room again, leaving behind him a faint smell of pit dirt. Mrs. Morel had a visit every day from the Congregational clergyman. Mr. Heaton was young and very poor. His wife had died at the birth of his first baby, so he remained alone in the manse. He was a Bachelor of Arts of Cambridge, very shy and no preacher. Mrs. Morel was fond of him, and he depended on her. For hours he talked to her when she was well. He became the godparent of the child. Occasionally the minister stayed to tea with Mrs. Morel. Then she laid the cloth early, got out her best cups with a little green rim, and hoped Morel would not come too soon. Indeed, if he stayed for a pint, she would not mind this day. She had always 2 dinners to cook, because she believed children should have their chief meal at midday, whereas Morel needed his at 5 o'clock. So Mr. Heaton would hold the baby, whilst Mrs. Morel beat up a batter pudding or peeled the potatoes, and he, watching her all the time, would discuss his next sermon. His ideas were quaint and fantastic. She brought him judiciously to earth. It was a discussion of the wedding at Cana. "When he changed the water into wine at Cana," he said, "that is a symbol that the ordinary life, even the blood, of the married husband and wife, which had before been uninspired, like water, became filled with the Spirit, and was as wine, because, when love enters, the whole spiritual constitution of a man changes, is filled with the Holy Ghost, and almost his form is altered." Mrs. Morel thought to herself, "Yes, poor fellow, his young wife is dead. That is why he makes his love into the Holy Ghost." They were halfway down their first cup of tea when they heard the sluther of pit boots. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Morel, in spite of herself. The minister looked rather scared.
Morel entered. He was feeling rather savage. He nodded a "How do you do" to the clergyman, who rose to shake hands with him. "Nay," said Morel, showing his hand. "Look thee at it. Thee never wants to shake hands with a hand like that, does ter? There's too much pickhaft and shovel dirt on it." The minister flushed with confusion, and sat down again. Mrs. Morel rose, carried out the steaming saucepan. Morel took off his coat, dragged his armchair to table, and sat down heavily. "Are you tired?" asked the clergyman. "Tired? I am that," replied Morel. "You don't know what it is to be tired, as I'm tired." "No," replied the clergyman. "Why, look you here," said the miner, showing the shoulders of his singlet. "It's a bit dry now, but it's wet as a clout with sweat even yet. Feel it." "Goodness!" cried Mrs. Morel. "Mr. Heaton doesn't want to feel your nasty singlet." The clergyman put out his hand gingerly. "No, perhaps he doesn't," said Morel, "but it's all come out of me, whether or not. And every day alike my singlet's wringing wet. Haven't you got a drink, missus, for a man when he comes home barkled up from the pit?" "You know you drank all the beer," said Mrs. Morel, pouring out his tea. "And was there no more to be got?" Turning to the clergyman, "A man gets that caked up with the dust, you know, that clogged up down a coal mine, he needs a drink when he comes home." "I'm sure he does," said the clergyman. "But it's 10 to 1 if there's out for him." "There's water and there's tea," said Mrs. Morel. "Water! It's not water as'll clear his throat." He poured out a saucerful of tea, blew it, and sucked it up through his great black moustache, sighing afterwards. Then he poured out another saucerful, and stood his cup on the table. "My cloth!" cried Mrs. Morel, putting it on a plate. "A man as comes home as I do's too tired to care about cloths," said Morel. "Pity!" exclaimed his wife sarcastically. The room was full of the smell of meat and vegetables and pit clothes. He leaned over to the minister, his great moustache thrust forward, his mouth very red in his black face. "Mr. Heaton," he said, "a man as has been down the black hole all day, dinging away at a coal-face, ay, a sight hotter than that wall—" "Needn't make a moan of it," put in Mrs. Morel. She hated her husband because, whenever he had an audience, he whined and played for sympathy. William, sitting nursing the baby, hated him, with a boy's hatred for false sentiment, and for the stupid treatment of his mother. Annie had never liked him. She merely avoided him. When the minister had gone, Mrs. Morel looked at her cloth. "A fine mess," she said. "Dost think I'm going to sit with my arms dangling 'cause thou's got a parson for tea with 'ee?" he bawled. They were both angry, but she said nothing. The baby began to cry, and Mrs. Morel, picking up a saucepan from the hearth, accidentally knocked Annie on the head, whereupon the girl began to whine, and Morel to shout at her. In the midst of this pandemonium, William looked up at the big glazed text over the mantelpiece and read distinctly, "God bless our home." Whereupon Mrs. Morel, trying to soothe the baby, jumped up, rushed at him, boxed his ears, saying, "What are you putting in for?" And then she sat down and laughed, till tears ran over her cheeks, while William kicked the stool he had been sitting on, and Morel growled, "I cannot see what there is so much to laugh at." One evening, directly after the parson's visit, feeling unable to bear herself after another display from her husband, she took Annie and the baby and went out. Morel had kicked William, and the mother would never forgive him. She went over the sheep bridge and across a corner of the meadow to the cricket ground. The meadows seemed one space of ripe evening light, whispering with the distant mill race. She sat on a seat under the alders in the cricket ground, and fronted the evening.
Before her, level and solid, spread the big green cricket field, like the bed of a sea of light. Children played in the bluish shadow of the pavilion. Many rooks, high up, came cawing home across the softly woven sky. They stooped in a long curve down into the golden glow, concentrating, cawing, wheeling, like black flakes on a slow vortex, over a tree clump that made a dark boss among the pasture. A few gentlemen were practising, and Mrs. Morel could hear the chock of the ball, and the voices of men suddenly roused, could see the white forms of men shifting silently over the green, upon which already the under-shadows were smouldering. Away at the grange, one side of the haystacks was lit up, the other sides blue-grey. A wagon of sheaves rocked small across the melting yellow light. The sun was going down. Every open evening the hills of Derbyshire were blazed over with red sunset. Mrs. Morel watched the sun sink from the glistening sky, leaving a soft flower blue overhead, while the western space went red, as if all the fire had swum down there, leaving the bell cast flawless blue. The mountain ash berries across the field stood fierily out from the dark leaves for a moment. A few shocks of corn in a corner of the fallow stood up as if alive. She imagined them bowing. Perhaps her son would be a Joseph. In the east, a mirrored sunset floated pink opposite the west scarlet. The big haystacks on the hillside, that butted into the glare, went cold. With Mrs. Morel it was one of those still moments when the small frets vanish, and the beauty of things stands out, and she had the peace and the strength to see herself. Now and again the swallow cut close to her. Now and again Annie came up with a handful of alder currants. The baby was restless on his mother's knee, clambering with his hands at the light. Mrs. Morel looked down at him. She had dreaded this baby like a catastrophe, because of her feeling for her husband, and now she felt strangely towards the infant. Her heart was heavy, because of the child, almost as if it were unhealthy or malformed. Yet it seemed quite well. But she noticed the peculiar knitting of the baby's brows, and the peculiar heaviness of its eyes, as if it were trying to understand something that was pain. She felt, when she looked at her child's dark, brooding pupils, as if a burden were on her heart. "He looks as if he were thinking about something, quite sorrowful," said Mrs. Kirk. Suddenly, looking at him, the heavy feeling at the mother's heart melted into a passionate grief. She bowed over him, and a few tears shook swiftly out of her very heart. The baby lifted his fingers. "My lamb!" she cried softly. And at that moment she felt, in some far inner place of her soul, that she and her husband were guilty. The baby was looking up at her. It had blue eyes like her own, but its look was heavy, steady, as if it had realized something that had stunned some point of its soul. In her arms lay the delicate baby. Its deep blue eyes, always looking up at her unblinking, seemed to draw her innermost thoughts out of her. She no longer loved her husband. She had not wanted this child to come, and there it lay in her arms and pulled at her heart. She felt as if the navel string that had connected its frail little body with hers had not been broken. A wave of hot love went over her to the infant. She held it close to her face and breast. With all her force, with all her soul, she would make up to it for having brought it into the world unloved. She would love it all the more now it was here, carry it in her love. Its clear, knowing eyes gave her pain and fear. Did it know all about her? When it lay under her heart, had it been listening then? Was there a reproach in the look? She felt the marrow melt in her bones with fear and pain. Once more she was aware of the sun lying red on the rim of the hill opposite. She suddenly held up the child in her hands. "Look," she said. "Look, my pretty." She thrust the infant forward to the crimson, throbbing sun, almost with relief. She saw him lift his little fist. Then she put him to her bosom again, ashamed almost of her impulse to give him back again whence he came. "If he lives," she thought to herself, "what will become of him? What will he be?" Her heart was anxious. "I will call him Paul," she said suddenly, she knew not why. After a while she went home. A fine shadow was flung over the deep green meadow, darkening all. As she expected, she found the house empty. But Morel was home by 10 o'clock, and that day, at least, ended peacefully. Walter Morel was at this time exceedingly irritable. His work seemed to exhaust him. When he came home he did not speak civilly to anybody. If the fire were rather low, he bullied about that. He grumbled about his dinner. If the children made a chatter, he shouted at them in a way that made their mother's blood boil, and made them hate him. On the Friday he was not home by 11 o'clock. The baby was unwell and was restless, crying if he were put down. Mrs. Morel, tired to death, and still weak, was scarcely under control. "I wish the nuisance would come," she said wearily to herself. The child at last sank down to sleep in her arms. She was too tired to carry him to the cradle. "But I'll say nothing, whatever time he comes," she said. "It only works me up. I won't say anything. But I know if he does anything it'll make my blood boil," she added to herself. She sighed, hearing him coming, as if it were something she could not bear. He, taking his revenge, was nearly drunk. She kept her head bent over the child as he entered, not wishing to see him. But it went through her like a flash of hot fire when, in passing, he lurched against the dresser, setting the tins rattling, and clutched at the white pot knobs for support. He hung up his hat and coat, then returned, stood glowering from a distance at her, as she sat bowed over the child. "Is there nothing to eat in the house?" he asked, insolently, as if to a servant. In certain stages of his intoxication he affected the clipped, mincing speech of the towns. Mrs. Morel hated him most in this condition. "You know what there is in the house," she said, so coldly it sounded impersonal. He stood and glared at her without moving a muscle. "I asked a civil question, and I expect a civil answer," he said affectedly. "And you got it," she said, still ignoring him. He glowered again. Then he came unsteadily forward. He leaned on the table with one hand, and with the other jerked at the table drawer to get a knife to cut bread. The drawer stuck because he pulled sideways. In a temper he dragged it, so that it flew out bodily, and spoons, forks, knives, 100 metallic things splashed with a clatter and a clang upon the brick floor. The baby gave a little convulsed start. "What are you doing, clumsy drunken fool?" the mother cried. "Then thou should get the flamin' thing thysen. Thou should get up, like other women have to, and wait on a man." "Wait on you? Wait on you?" she cried. "Yes, I see myself." "Yes, and I'll learn thee thou's got to. Wait on me. Yes, thou shalt wait on me." "Never, my lord. I'd wait on a dog at the door first." "What? What?" He was trying to fit in the drawer. At her last speech he turned round. His face was crimson, his eyes bloodshot. He stared at her one silent second in threat. "Pfft!" she went quickly, in contempt. He jerked at the drawer in his excitement. It fell, cut sharply on his shin, and on the reflex he flung it at her. One of the corners caught her brow as the shallow drawer crashed into the fireplace. She swayed, almost fell stunned from her chair. To her very soul she was sick. She clasped the child tightly to her bosom. A few moments elapsed. Then, with an effort, she brought herself to. The baby was crying plaintively. Her left brow was bleeding rather profusely. As she glanced down at the child, her brain reeling, some drops of blood soaked into its white shawl, but the baby was at least not hurt. She balanced her head to keep equilibrium so that the blood ran into her eye. Walter Morel remained as he had stood, leaning on the table with one hand, looking blank. When he was sufficiently sure of his balance, he went across to her, swayed, caught hold of the back of her rocking-chair, almost tipping her out. Then leaning forward over her, and swaying as he spoke, he said, in a tone of wondering concern, "Did it catch thee?" He swayed again, as if he would pitch on to the child. With the catastrophe he had lost all balance. "Go away," she said, struggling to keep her presence of mind. He hiccuped. "Let's look at it," he said, hiccuping again. "Go away," she cried. Let me look at it, lass." She smelled him of drink, felt the unequal pull of his swaying grasp on the back of her rocking-chair. "Go away," she said, and weakly she pushed him off. He stood, uncertain in balance, gazing upon her. Summoning all her strength, she rose, the baby on one arm. By a cruel effort of will, moving as if in sleep, she went across to the scullery, where she bathed her eye for a minute in cold water. But she was too dizzy. Afraid lest she should swoon, she returned to her rocking-chair, trembling in every fibre. By instinct she kept the baby clasped. Morel, bothered, had succeeded in pushing the drawer back into its cavity, and was on his knees, groping, with numb paws, for the scattered spoons. Her brow was still bleeding. Presently Morel got up and came craning his neck towards her. "What has it done to thee, lass?" he asked in a very wretched, humble tone. "You can see what it's done," she answered. He stood, bending forward, supported on his hands, which grasped his legs just above the knee. He peered to look at the wound. She drew away from the thrust of his face with its great moustache, averting her own face as much as possible. As he looked at her, who was cold and impassive as stone, with mouth shut tight, he sickened with feebleness and hopelessness of spirit. He was turning drearily away, when he saw a drop of blood fall from the averted wound into the baby's fragile, glistening hair. Fascinated, he watched the heavy, dark drop hang in the glistening cloud, and pull down the gossamer. Another drop fell. It would soak through to the baby's scalp. He watched, fascinated, feeling it soak in. Then finally his manhood broke. "What of this child?" was all his wife said to him, but her low, intense tones brought his head lower. She softened. "Get me some wadding out of the middle drawer," she said. He stumbled away very obediently, presently returning with a pad which she singed before the fire, then put on her forehead, as she sat with the baby on her lap. "Now that clean pit scarf." Again he rummaged and fumbled in the drawer, returning presently with a red, narrow scarf. She took it, and with trembling fingers proceeded to bind it round her head. "Let me tie it for thee," he said humbly. "I can do it myself," she replied. When it was done she went upstairs, telling him to rake the fire and lock the door. In the morning Mrs. Morel said, "I knocked against the latch of the coal place when I was getting a raker in the dark, because the candle blew out." Her two small children looked up at her with wide, dismayed eyes. They said nothing, but their parted lips seemed to express the unconscious tragedy they felt. Walter Morel lay in bed next day until nearly dinner-time. He did not think of the previous evening's work. He scarcely thought of anything, but he would not think of that. He lay and suffered like a sulking dog. He had hurt himself most, and he was the more damaged because he would never say a word to her or express his sorrow. He tried to wriggle out of it. "It was her own fault," he said to himself. Nothing, however, could prevent his inner consciousness inflicting on him the punishment which ate into his spirit like rust, and which he could only alleviate by drinking. He felt as if he had not the initiative to get up, or to say a word, or to move, but could only lie like a log. Moreover, he had himself violent pains in the head. It was Saturday. Towards noon he rose, cut himself food in the pantry, ate it with his head dropped, then pulled on his boots and went out, to return at 3 o'clock slightly tipsy and relieved, then once more straight to bed. He rose again at 6 in the evening, had tea, and went straight out. Sunday was the same: bed till noon, the Palmerston Arms till 2:30, dinner and bed, scarcely a word spoken. When Mrs. Morel went upstairs towards 4 o'clock to put on her Sunday dress, he was fast asleep. She would have felt sorry for him if he had once said, "Wife, I'm sorry." But no, he insisted to himself it was her fault, and so he broke himself, so she merely left him alone. There was this deadlock of passion between them, and she was stronger. The family began tea. Sunday was the only day when all sat down to meals together. "Isn't my father going to get up?" asked William. "Let him lie," the mother replied. There was a feeling of misery over all the house. The children breathed the air that was poisoned, and they felt dreary. They were rather disconsolate, did not know what to do, what to play at. Immediately Morel woke, he got straight out of bed. That was characteristic of him all his life. He was all for activity. The prostrated inactivity of 2 mornings was stifling him. It was near 6 o'clock when he got down. This time he entered without hesitation, his wincing sensitiveness having hardened again. He did not care any longer what the family thought or felt. The tea things were on the table. William was reading aloud from The Child's Own. Annie listening and asking eternally, "Why?" Both children hushed into silence as they heard the approaching thud of their father's stockinged feet, and shrank as he entered, yet he was usually indulgent to them. Morel made the meal alone, brutally. He ate and drank more noisily than he had need. No one spoke to him. The family life withdrew, shrank away, and became hushed as he entered. But he cared no longer about his alienation. Immediately he had finished tea, he rose with alacrity to go out. It was this alacrity, this haste to be gone, which so sickened Mrs. Morel. As she heard him sousing heartily in cold water, heard the eager scratch of the steel comb on the side of the bowl as he wetted his hair, she closed her eyes in disgust. As he bent over, lacing his boots, there was a certain vulgar gusto in his movement that divided him from the reserved, watchful rest of the family. He always ran away from the battle with himself. Even in his own heart's privacy, he excused himself, saying, "If she hadn't said so and so, it would never have happened. She asked for what she's got." The children waited in restraint during his preparations. When he had gone, they sighed with relief. He closed the door behind him and was glad. It was a rainy evening. The Palmerston would be the cosier. He hastened forward in anticipation. All the slate roofs of the bottoms shone black with wet. The roads, always dark with coal dust, were full of blackish mud. He hastened along. The Palmerston windows were steamed over. The passage was paddled with wet feet. But the air was warm, if foul, and full of the sounds of voices and the smell of beer and smoke. "What shalt have, Walter?" cried a voice as soon as Morel appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Jim, my lad, wherever has thee sprung from?" The men made a seat for him, and took him in warmly. He was glad. In a minute or two they had thawed all responsibility out of him, all shame, all trouble, and he was clear as a bell for a jolly night. On the Wednesday following, Morel was penniless. He dreaded his wife. Having hurt her, he hated her. He did not know what to do with himself that evening, having not even twopence, with which to go to the Palmerston, and being already rather deeply in debt. So, while his wife was down in the garden with the child, he hunted in the top drawer of the dresser where she kept her purse, found it, and looked inside. It contained a half-crown, 2 halfpennies, and a sixpence. So he took the sixpence, put the purse carefully back, and went out. The next day, when she wanted to pay the greengrocer, she looked in the purse for her sixpence, and her heart sank to her shoes. Then she sat down and thought, was there a sixpence? I hadn't spent it, had I? And I hadn't left it anywhere else? She was much put about. She hunted round everywhere for it, and, as she sought, the conviction came into her heart that her husband had taken it. What she had in her purse was all the money she possessed, but that he should sneak it from her thus was unbearable. He had done so twice before. The first time she had not accused him, and at the week-end he had put the shilling again into her purse. So that was how she had known he had taken it. The second time he had not paid back. This time she felt it was too much. When he had had his dinner, he came home early that day, she said to him coldly, "Did you take sixpence out of my purse last night?" "Me?" he said, looking up in an offended way. "No, I didna. I niver clapped eyes on your purse." But she could detect the lie. "Why, you know you did," she said quietly. "I tell you I didna!" he shouted. "You're at me again, are you? I've had about enough on it." "So you filched sixpence out of my purse while I'm taking the clothes in." "How may yer pay for this?" he said, pushing back his chair in desperation. He bustled and got washed, then went determinedly upstairs. Presently he came down dressed, and with a big bundle in a blue-checked, enormous handkerchief. "And now," he said, "you'll see me again when you do." "It'll be before I want to," she replied, and at that he marched out of the house with his bundle. She sat trembling slightly, but her heart brimming with contempt. What would she do if he went to some other pit, obtained work, and got in with another woman? But she knew him too well. He couldn't. She was dead sure of him. Nevertheless, her heart was gnawed inside her. "Where's my dad?" said William, coming in from school. "He says he's run away," replied the mother. "Where to?" "I don't know. He's taken a bundle in the blue handkerchief, and says he's not coming back." "What shall we do?" cried the boy. Never trouble. He won't go far." "But if he doesn't come back?" wailed Annie. And she and William retired to the sofa and wept. Mrs. Morel sat and laughed. "You pair of gabies!" she exclaimed. "You'll see him before the night's out." But the children were not to be consoled. Twilight came on. Mrs. Morel grew anxious from very weariness. One part of her said it would be a relief to see the last of him. Another part fretted because of keeping the children, and inside her, as yet, she could not quite let him go. At the bottom, she knew very well he could not go. When she went down to the coal place at the end of the garden, however, she felt something behind the door, so she looked, and there in the dark lay the big blue bundle. She sat on a piece of coal and laughed. Every time she saw it, so fat and yet so ignominious, slunk into its corner in the dark, with its ends flopping like dejected ears from the knots, she laughed again. She was relieved. Mrs. Morel sat waiting. He had not any money, she knew, so if he stopped he was running up a bill. She was very tired of him, tired to death. He had not even the courage to carry his bundle beyond the yard end. As she meditated, at about 9 o'clock, he opened the door and came in, slinking and yet sulky. She said not a word. He took off his coat and slunk to his armchair, where he began to take off his boots. "You'd better fetch your bundle before you take your boots off," she said quietly. "You may thank your stars I've come back tonight," he said, looking up from under his dropped head sulkily, trying to be impressive. "Why, where should you have gone? You daren't even get your parcel out through the yard end," she said. He looked such a fool she was not even angry with him. He continued to take his boots off and prepare for bed. "I don't know what's in your blue handkerchief," she said, "but if you leave it, the children shall fetch it in the morning." Whereupon he got up and went out of the house, returning presently, and crossing the kitchen with averted face, hurrying upstairs. As Mrs. Morel saw him slink quickly through the inner doorway, holding his bundle, she laughed to herself. But her heart was bitter, because she had loved him. End of chapter.
Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 3. The Casting Off of Morel, the Taking On of William. During the next week Morel's temper was almost unbearable. Like all miners, he was a great lover of medicines, which, strangely enough, he would often pay for himself.
"You mun get me a drop o' laxy-vitral,"
he said.
"It's a winder as we canna have a sup in a house."
So Mrs. Morel bought him an elixir of vitriol, his favourite first medicine, and he made himself a jug of wormwood tea. He had hanging in the attic great bunches of dried herbs, wormwood, rue, horehound, elderflowers, parsley-pert, marshmallow, hyssop, dandelion, and centaury. Usually there was a jug of one or other decoction standing on the hob, from which he drank largely.
"Grand!"
he said, smacking his lips after wormwood.
"Grand!"
And he exhorted the children to try.
"It's better than any of your tea or your cocoa stews,"
he vowed, but they were not to be tempted. This time, however, neither pills nor vitriol nor all his herbs would shift the nasty peens in his head. He was sickening for an attack of an inflammation of the brain. He had never been well since his sleeping on the ground when he went with Jerry to Nottingham. Since then he had drunk and stormed. Now he fell seriously ill, and Mrs. Morel had him to nurse. He was one of the worst patients imaginable. But, in spite of all, and putting aside the fact that he was the breadwinner, she never quite wanted him to die. Still, there was one part of her wanted him for herself. The neighbours were very good to her. Occasionally some had the children in to meals. Occasionally some would do the downstairs work for her. One would mind the baby for a day. But it was a great drag, nevertheless. It was not every day the neighbours helped. Then she had nursing of baby and husband, cleaning and cooking, everything to do. She was quite worn out, but she did what was wanted of her. And the money was just sufficient. She had 17 shillings a week from clubs, and every Friday Barker and the other buddy put by a portion of the stall's profits for Morel's wife. And the neighbours made broths, and gave eggs, and such invalids' trifles. If they had not helped her so generously in those times, Mrs. Morel would never have pulled through, without incurring debts that would have dragged her down. The weeks passed. Morel, almost against hope, grew better. He had a fine constitution, so that, once on the mend, he went straight forward to recovery. Soon he was pottering about downstairs. During his illness his wife had spoiled him a little. Now he wanted her to continue. He often put his hand to his head, pulled down the corners of his mouth, and shammed pains he did not feel. But there was no deceiving her. At first she merely smiled to herself. Then she scolded him sharply.
"Goodness, man, don't be so lachrymose."
That wounded him slightly, but still he continued to feign sickness.
"I wouldn't be such a mardy baby," said the wife shortly.
Then he was indignant, and cursed under his breath, like a boy. He was forced to resume a normal tone, and to cease to whine. Nevertheless, there was a state of peace in the house for some time. Mrs. Morel was more tolerant of him, and he, depending on her almost like a child, was rather happy. Neither knew that she was more tolerant because she loved him less. Up till this time, in spite of all, he had been her husband and her man. She had felt that, more or less, what he did to himself he did to her. Her living depended on him. There were many, many stages in the ebbing of her love for him, but it was always ebbing. Now, with the birth of this third baby, herself no longer set towards him, helplessly, but was like a tide that scarcely rose, standing off from him. After this she scarcely desired him, and, standing more aloof from him, not feeling him so much part of herself, but merely part of her circumstances, she did not mind so much what he did, could leave him alone. There was the halt, the wistfulness about the ensuing year, which is like autumn in a man's life. His wife was casting him off, half regretfully, but relentlessly, casting him off and turning now for love and life to the children. Henceforward he was more or less a husk. And he himself acquiesced, as so many men do, yielding their place to their children. During his recuperation, when it was really over between them, both made an effort to come back somewhat to the old relationship of the first months of their marriage. He sat at home and, when the children were in bed and she was sewing, she did all her sewing by hand, made all shirts and children's clothing, he would read to her from the newspaper, slowly pronouncing and delivering the words like a man pitching quoits. Often she hurried him on, giving him a phrase in anticipation, and then he took her words humbly. The silences between them were peculiar. There would be the swift, slight cluck of her needle, the sharp pop of his lips as he let out the smoke, the warmth, the sizzle on the bars as he spat in the fire. Then her thoughts turned to William. Already he was getting a big boy. Already he was top of the class, and the master said he was the smartest lad in the school. She saw him a man, young, full of vigor, making the world glow again for her. And Morel, sitting there, quite alone, and having nothing to think about, would be feeling vaguely uncomfortable. His soul would reach out in its blind way to her, and find her gone. He felt a sort of emptiness, almost like a vacuum in his soul. He was unsettled and restless. Soon he could not live in that atmosphere, and he affected his wife. Both felt an oppression on their breathing when they were left together for some time. Then he went to bed, and she settled down to enjoy herself alone, working, thinking, living. Meanwhile another infant was coming, fruit of this little peace and tenderness between the separating parents. Paul was 17 months old when the new baby was born. He was then a plump, pale child, quiet, with heavy blue eyes, and still the peculiar slight knitting of the brows. The last child was also a boy, fair and bonny. Mrs. Morel was sorry when she knew she was with child, both for economic reasons and because she did not love her husband, but not for the sake of the infant. They called the baby Arthur. He was very pretty, with a mop of gold curls, and he loved his father from the first. Mrs. Morel was glad this child loved the father. Hearing the miner's footsteps, the baby would put up his arms and crow. And if Morel were in a good temper, he called back immediately, in his hearty, mellow voice, "What then, my beauty? I shall come to thee in a minute." And as soon as he had taken off his pit-coat, Mrs. Morel would put an apron round the child and give him to his father. "What a sight the lad looks!" she would exclaim sometimes, taking back the baby that was smutted on the face from his father's kisses and play. Then Morel laughed joyfully. "He's a little collier, bless this bit of mutton!" he exclaimed. And these were the happy moments of her life now, when the children included the father in her heart. Meanwhile William grew bigger and stronger and more active, while Paul, always rather delicate and quiet, got slimmer and trotted after his mother like her shadow. He was usually active and interested, but sometimes he would have fits of depression. Then the mother would find the boy of 3 or 4 crying on the sofa. "What's the matter?" she asked, and got no answer. "What's the matter?" she insisted, getting cross. "I don't know," sobbed the child. So she tried to reason him out of it, or to amuse him, but without effect. It made her feel beside herself. Then the father, always impatient, would jump from his chair and shout, "If he doesn't stop, I'll smack him till he does." "You'll do nothing of the sort," said the mother coldly. And then she carried the child into the yard, plumped him into his little chair, and said, "Now cry there, misery." And then a butterfly on the rhubarb leaves perhaps caught his eye, or at last he cried himself to sleep. These fits were not often, but they caused a shadow in Mrs. Morel's heart, and her treatment of Paul was different from that of the other children. Suddenly one morning, as she was looking down the alley of the Bottoms for the barman, she heard a voice calling her. It was the thin little Mrs. Anthony in brown velvet. "Here, Mrs. Morel, I want to tell you about your Willie." "Oh, do you?" replied Mrs. Morel. "Why, what's the matter?" "A lad as gets hold of another and rips his clothes off'n his back," Mrs. Anthony said, "wants showing something." "Your Alfred's as old as my William," said Mrs. Morel. "'Appen he is, but that doesn't give him a right to get hold of the boy's collar and fair rip it clean off his back." "Well," said Mrs. Morel, "I don't thrash my children, and even if I did, I should want to hear their side of the tale." "They'd happen be a bit better if they did get a good hiding," retorted Mrs. Anthony. "When it comes to ripping a lad's clean collar off'n his back a purpose—" "I'm sure he didn't do it on purpose," said Mrs. Morel. "Make me a liar!" shouted Mrs. Anthony. Mrs. Morel moved away and closed her gate. Her hand trembled as she held her mug of barm. "But I shall let your mester know," Mrs. Anthony cried after her. At dinner-time, when William had finished his meal and wanted to be off again, he was then 11 years old, his mother said to him, "What did you tear Alfred Anthony's collar for?" "When did I tear his collar?" "I don't know when, but his mother says you did." "Why, it was yesterday, and it was torn already." "But you tore it more." "Well, I'd 'a got a cobbler as had licked 17, and Alfie Anthony he says, 'Adam and Eve and Pinch-Me went down to a river to bade. Adam and Eve got drownded. Who do you think got saved?' And so I says, 'Oh, pinch you!' And so I pinched him, and he was mad, and so he snatched my cobbler and run off with it. And so I run after him, and when I was getting hold of him, he dodged and it ripped his collar. But I got my cobbler." He pulled from his pocket a black old horse-chestnut hanging on a string. This old cobbler had cobbled, hit and smashed 17 other cobblers on similar strings, so the boy was proud of his veteran. "Well," said Mrs. Morel, "you know you've no right to rip his collar." "Well, our mother," he answered. "I never meant to ha' done it, and it was only an old india-rubber collar as was torn already." "Next time," said his mother, "you be more careful. I shouldn't like it if you came home with your collar torn off." "I don't care, our mother. I never did it a purpose." The boy was rather miserable at being reprimanded. "No, well, you be more careful." William fled away, glad to be exonerated, and Mrs. Morel, who hated any bother with the neighbours, thought she would explain to Mrs. Anthony, and the business would be over. But that evening Morel came in from the pit looking very sour. He stood in the kitchen and glared round, but did not speak for some minutes. Then, "Where's that Willie?" he asked. "What do you want him for?" asked Mrs. Morel, who had guessed. "I'll let him know when I get him," said Morel, banging his pit bottle on to the dresser. "I suppose Mrs. Anthony's got hold of you and been yarning to you about Alfie's collar," said Mrs. Morel, rather sneering. "Niver mind who's got hold of me," said Morel. "When I get hold of him, I'll make his bones rattle." "It's a poor tale,"
said Mrs. Morel, "that you're so ready to side with any snipey vixen who likes to come telling tales against your own children."
"I'll learn him," said Morel. "It none matters to me whose lad he is. He's none going ripping and tearing about just as he's a mind."
"Ripping and tearing about," repeated Mrs. Morel. "He was running after that Alfie who'd taken his cobbler, and he accidentally got hold of his collar because the other dodged, as an Anthony would."
"I know,"
shouted Morel threateningly. "You would before you're told," replied his wife bitingly.
"Niver you mind," stormed Morel. "I know my business."
"That's more than doubtful," said Mrs. Morel. "Supposing some loudmouth creature had been getting you to thrash your own children."
"I know," repeated Morel.
And he said no more, but sat and nursed his bad temper. Suddenly William ran in, saying,
"Can I have my tea, mother?"
"Tha can have more than that,"
shouted Morel. "Hold your noise, man," said Mrs. Morel, "and don't look so ridiculous."
"He'll look ridiculous before I'm done with him,"
shouted Morel, rising from his chair and glaring at his son. William, who was a tall lad for his years, but very sensitive, had gone pale, and was looking in a sort of horror at his father. "Go out," Mrs. Morel commanded her son. William had not the wit to move. Suddenly Morel clenched his fists and crouched.
"I'll give you go out,"
he shouted like an insane thing.
"What?" cried Mrs. Morel, panting with rage. "You shall not touch him for her telling. You shall not."
"Shouldn't I?"
shouted Morel.
"Shouldn't I?"
And glaring at the boy, he ran forward. Mrs. Morel sprang in between them, with her fists lifted.
"Don't you dare!" she cried.
"What?"
he shouted, baffled for the moment.
"What?"
She spun round to her son.
"Go out of the house!"
she commanded him in fury. The boy, as if hypnotized by her, turned suddenly and was gone. Morel rushed to the door, but was too late. He returned, pale under his pit dirt with fury. But now his wife was fully roused.
"Only dare," she said in a loud, ringing voice, "only dare, milord, to lay a finger on that child. You'll regret it for ever."
He was afraid of her. In a towering rage, he sat down. When the children were old enough to be left, Mrs. Morel joined the Women's Guild. It was a little club of women attached to the Cooperative Wholesale Society, which met on Monday night in the long room over the grocery shop of the Bestwood Co-op. The women were supposed to discuss the benefits to be derived from cooperation and other social questions. Sometimes Mrs. Morel read a paper. It seemed queer to the children to see their mother, who was always busy about the house, sitting writing in her rapid fashion, thinking, referring to books, and writing again. They felt for her on such occasions the deepest respect. But they loved the Guild. It was the only thing to which they did not grudge their mother, and that partly because she enjoyed it, partly because of the treats they derived from it. The Guild was called by some hostile husbands, who found their wives getting too independent, the Clatfart shop, that is, the gossip shop. It is true, from off the basis of the Guild, the women could look at their homes, at the conditions of their own lives, and find fault. So the colliers found their women had a new standard of their own, rather disconcerting. And also, Mrs. Morel always had a lot of news on Monday nights, so that the children liked William to be in when their mother came home, because she told him things. Then, when the lad was 13, she got him a job in the Co-op office. He was a very clever boy, frank, with rather rough features and real Viking blue eyes.
"What dost want to make a stool horse jack on him for?" said Morel. "All he'll do is wear his breeches behind out, and earn nowt. What's he starting with?"
"It doesn't matter what he's starting with," said Mrs. Morel.
"It wouldna. Put him in the pit with me, and he'll earn an easy 10 shillin' a week from the start. But 6 shillin' wearing his truck end out on a stool's better'n 10 shillin' in the pit with me, I know."
"He is not going in the pit," said Mrs. Morel, "and there's an end of it."
"It were good enough for me, but none good enough for him."
"If your mother put you in the pit at 12, it's no reason why I should do the same with my lad."
12! It were a sight before that."
"Whenever it was," said Mrs. Morel. She was very proud of her son. He went to the night school and learned shorthand, so that by the time he was 16 he was the best shorthand clerk and bookkeeper on the place, except one. Then he taught in the night schools. But he was so fiery that only his good nature and his size protected him. All the things that men do, the decent things, William did. He could run like the wind. When he was 12 he won a first prize in a race, an inkstand of glass shaped like an anvil. It stood proudly on the dresser, and gave Mrs. Morel a keen pleasure. The boy only ran for her. He flew home with his anvil, breathless, with a "Look, mother!" That was the first real tribute to herself. She took it like a queen. "How pretty!" she exclaimed. Then he began to get ambitious. He gave all his money to his mother. When he earned 14 shillings a week, she gave him back 2 for himself, and, as he never drank, he felt himself rich. He went about with the bourgeois of Bestwood. The townlet contained nothing higher than the clergyman. Then came the bank manager, then the doctors, then the tradespeople, and after that the hosts of colliers. William began to consort with the sons of the chemist, the schoolmaster, and the tradesman. He played billiards in the mechanics' hall. Also he danced. This in spite of his mother. All the life that Bestwood offered he enjoyed, from the sixpenny hops down Church Street to sports and billiards. Paul was treated to dazzling descriptions of all kinds of flower-like ladies, most of whom lived like cut blooms in William's heart for a brief fortnight. Occasionally some flame would come in pursuit of her errant swain. Mrs. Morel would find a strange girl at the door, and immediately she sniffed the air. "Is Mr. Morel in?" the damsel would ask appealingly. "My husband is at home," Mrs. Morel replied. I mean young Mr. Morel," repeated the maiden painfully. "Which one? There are several." Whereupon much blushing and stammering from the fair one, I met Mr. Morel at Ripley," she explained. "Oh, at a dance?" "Yes." "I don't approve of the girls my son meets at dances, and he is not at home." Then he came home angry with his mother for having turned the girl away so rudely. He was a careless yet eager-looking fellow, who walked with long strides, sometimes frowning, often with his cap pushed jollily to the back of his head. Now he came in frowning. He threw his cap on to the sofa, and took his strong jaw in his hand, and glared down at his mother. She was small, with her hair taken straight back from her forehead. She had a quiet air of authority, and yet of rare warmth. Knowing her son was angry, she trembled inwardly. "Did a lady call for me yesterday, mother?" he asked. "I don't know about a lady. There was a girl came." "And why didn't you tell me?" "Because I forgot, simply." He fumed a little. "A good-looking girl? Seemed a lady?" "I didn't look at her." "Big brown eyes?" "I did not look. And tell your girls, my son, that when they're running after you, they're not to come and ask your mother for you. Tell them that, brazen baggages you meet at dancing classes." "I'm sure she was a nice girl." "And I'm sure she wasn't." There ended the altercation. Over the dancing there was a great strife between the mother and the son. The grievance reached its height when William said he was going to Hucknall Torkard, considered a low town, to a fancy dress ball. He was to be a Highlander. There was a dress he could hire, which one of his friends had had, and which fitted him perfectly. The Highland suit came home. Mrs. Morel received it coldly and would not unpack it. "My suit come?"
cried William.
"There's a parcel in the front room."
He rushed in and cut the string.
"How do you fancy your son in this?" he said, enraptured, showing her the suit. "You know I don't want to fancy you in it."
On the evening of the dance, when he had come home to dress, Mrs. Morel put on her coat and bonnet.
"Aren't you going to stop and see me, mother?" he asked. "No, I don't want to see you," she replied.
She was rather pale, and her face was closed and hard. She was afraid of her son's going the same way as his father. He hesitated a moment, and his heart stood still with anxiety. Then he caught sight of the Highland bonnet with its ribbons. He picked it up gleefully, forgetting her. She went out. When he was 19, he suddenly left the Co-op office and got a situation in Nottingham. In his new place he had 30 shillings a week instead of 18. This was indeed a rise. His mother and his father were brimmed up with pride. Everybody praised William. It seemed he was going to get on rapidly. Mrs. Morel hoped, with his aid, to help her younger sons. Annie was now studying to be a teacher. Paul, also very clever, was getting on well, having lessons in French and German from his godfather, the clergyman who was still a friend to Mrs. Morel. Arthur, a spoilt and very good-looking boy, was at the board school, but there was talk of his trying to get a scholarship for the high school in Nottingham. William remained a year at his new post in Nottingham. He was studying hard and growing serious. Something seemed to be fretting him. Still, he went out to the dances and the river parties. He did not drink. The children were all rabid teetotalers. He came home very late at night, and sat yet longer studying. His mother implored him to take more care, to do one thing or another.
"Dance if you want to dance, my son, but don't think you can work in the office, and then amuse yourself, and then study on top of all. You can't. The human frame won't stand it. Do one thing or the other. Amuse yourself or learn Latin, but don't try to do both."
Then he got a place in London, at 120 a year. This seemed a fabulous sum. His mother doubted almost whether to rejoice or to grieve.
"They want me in Lime Street on Monday week, mother," he cried, his eyes blazing as he read the letter.
Mrs. Morel felt everything go silent inside her. He read the letter.
"And will you reply by Thursday whether you accept? Yours faithfully." "They want me, mother, at 120 a year, and don't even ask to see me. Didn't I tell you I could do it? Think of me in London, and I can give you £20 a year, mater. We shall all be rolling in money." "We shall, my son," she answered sadly.
It never occurred to him that she might be more hurt at his going away than glad of his success. Indeed, as the days drew near for his departure, her heart began to close and grow dreary with despair. She loved him so much. More than that, she hoped in him so much. Almost she lived by him. She liked to do things for him. She liked to put a cup for his tea and to iron his collars, of which he was so proud. It was a joy to her to have him proud of his collars. There was no laundry, so she used to rub away at them with her little convex iron to polish them, till they shone from the sheer pressure of her arm. Now she would not do it for him. Now he was going away. She felt almost as if he were going as well out of her heart. He did not seem to leave her inhabited with himself. That was the grief and the pain to her. He took nearly all himself away. A few days before his departure, he was just 20, he burned his love letters. They had hung on a file at the top of the kitchen cupboard. From some of them he had read extracts to his mother. Some of them she had taken the trouble to read herself, but most were too trivial. Now, on the Saturday morning he said, "Come on, Postle, let's go through my letters, and you can have the birds and flowers." Mrs. Morel had done her Saturday's work on the Friday, because he was having a last day's holiday. She was making him a rice cake, which he loved, to take with him. He was scarcely conscious that she was so miserable. He took the first letter off the file. It was mauve-tinted, and had purple and green thistles. William sniffed the page. "Nice scent. Smell!" And he thrust the sheet under Paul's nose.
Said Paul, breathing in. "What do you call it? Smell, Mother."
His mother ducked her small, fine nose down to the paper.
"I don't want to smell their rubbish," she said, sniffing.
"This girl's father," said William, "is as rich as Croesus. He owns property without end. She calls me Lafayette because I know French. You will see, I've forgiven you. I like her forgiving me. I told Mother about you this morning, and she will have much pleasure if you come to tea on Sunday, but she will have to get Father's consent also. I sincerely hope he will agree. I will let you know how it transpires. If, however, you—" "Let you know how it what?" interrupted Mrs. Morel. "Transpires. Oh, yes." "Transpires," repeated Mrs. Morel mockingly. "I thought she was so well educated." William felt slightly uncomfortable, and abandoned this maiden, giving Paul the corner with the thistles. He continued to read extracts from his letters, some of which amused his mother, some of which saddened her, and made her anxious for him.
"My lad," she said, "they're very wise. They know they've only got to flatter your vanity, and you press up to them like a dog that has its head scratched."
"Well, they can't go on scratching forever," he replied, "and when they've done, I trot away."
"But one day you'll find a string round your neck that you can't pull off," she answered.
"Not me. I'm equal to any of 'em, mater. They needn't flatter themselves."
"You flatter yourself," she said quietly.
Soon there was a heap of twisted black pages, all that remained of the file of scented letters, except that Paul had 30 or 40 pretty tickets from the corners of the notepaper, swallows and forget-me-nots and ivy sprays, and William went to London to start a new life. End of chapter. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 4. The Young Life of Paul. Paul would be built like his mother, slightly and rather small. His fair hair went reddish, and then dark brown. His eyes were grey. He was a pale, quiet child, with eyes that seemed to listen, and with a full, dropping under lip. As a rule he seemed old for his years. He was so conscious of what other people felt, particularly his mother. When she fretted he understood, and could have no peace. His soul seemed always attentive to her. As he grew older he became stronger. William was too far removed from him to accept him as a companion, so the smaller boy belonged at first almost entirely to Annie. She was a tomboy, and a flyby-skyby, as her mother called her, but she was intensely fond of her second brother, so Paul was towed round at the heels of Annie, sharing her game. She raced wildly at lurkey with the other young wildcats of the bottoms, and always Paul flew beside her, living her share of the game, having as yet no part of his own. He was quiet and not noticeable, but his sister adored him. He always seemed to care for things if she wanted him to. She had a big doll of which she was fearfully proud, though not so fond. So she laid the doll on the sofa, and covered it with an antimacassar to sleep. Then she forgot it. Meantime Paul must practice jumping off the sofa arm, so he jumped crash into the face of the hidden doll. Annie rushed up, uttered a loud wail, and sat down to weep a dirge. Paul remained quite still. "You couldn't tell it was there, Mother. You couldn't tell it was there," he repeated over and over. So long as Annie wept for the doll he sat helpless with misery. Her grief wore itself out. She forgave her brother, he was so much upset. But a day or two afterwards she was shocked. "Let's make a sacrifice of Arabella," he said. "Let's burn her." She was horrified, yet rather fascinated. She wanted to see what the boy would do. He made an altar of bricks, pulled some of the shavings out of Arabella's body, put the waxen fragments into the hollow face, poured on a little paraffin, and set the whole thing alight. He watched with wicked satisfaction the drops of wax melt off the broken forehead of Arabella, and drop like sweat into the flame. So long as the stupid big doll burned, he rejoiced in silence. At the end he poked among the embers with a stick, fished out the arms and legs, all blackened, and smashed them under stones.
"That's the sacrifice of Mrs. Arabella," he said, "and I'm glad there's nothing left of her."
Which disturbed Annie inwardly, although she could say nothing. He seemed to hate the doll so intensely because he had broken it. All the children, but particularly Paul, were peculiarly against their father along with their mother. Morel continued to bully and to drink. He had periods, months at a time, when he made the whole life of the family a misery. Paul never forgot coming home from the Band of Hope one Monday evening, and finding his mother with her eyes swollen and discoloured, his father standing on the hearthrug, feet astride, his head down, and William, just home from work, glaring at his father. There was a silence as the young children entered, but none of the elders looked round. William was white to the lips, and his fists were clenched. He waited until the children were silent, watching with children's rage and hate. Then he said, "You coward, you daren't do it when I was in." But Morel's blood was up. He swung round on his son. William was bigger, but Morel was hard-muscled and mad with fury.
"Doesn't I?" he shouted. "Doesn't I? How much more of thy chelp, my young jockey, and I'll rattle my fist about thee. Aye, and I show that, dost see?" Morel crouched at the knees and showed his fist in an ugly, almost beast-like fashion. William was white with rage. "Will yer?" he said, quiet and intense. "It'd be the last time, though." Morel danced a little nearer, crouching, drawing back his fist to strike. William put his fists ready. A light came into his blue eyes, almost like a laugh. He watched his father. Another word, and the men would have begun to fight. Paul hoped they would. The three children sat pale on the sofa. "Stop it, both of you!" cried Mrs. Morel in a hard voice. "We've had enough for one night. And you," she said, turning on to her husband, "look at your children." Morel glanced at the sofa. "Look at the children, you nasty little bitch," he sneered. "Why, what have I done to the children, I should like to know? But they're like yourself. You've put 'em up to your own tricks and nasty ways. You've learned 'em in it, you have." She refused to answer him. No one spoke. After a while he threw his boots under the table and went to bed. "Why didn't you let me have a go at him?" said William when his father was upstairs. "I could easily have beaten him." "A nice thing, your own father," she replied. "Father," repeated William. "Call him my father." "Well, he is, and so—" "But why don't you let me settle him? I could do easily." "The idea!" she cried. "It hasn't come to that yet." "No," he said. "It's come to worse. Look at yourself. Why didn't you let me give it him?" "Because I couldn't bear it, so never think of it," she cried quickly. And the children went to bed miserably. When William was growing up, the family moved from the Bottoms to a house on the brow of the hill, commanding a view of the valley, which spread out like a convex cockle-shell or a clamp-shell before it. In front of the house was a huge old ash-tree. The west wind, sweeping from Derbyshire, caught the houses with full force, and the tree shrieked again. Morel liked it. "It's music," he said. "It sends me to sleep." But Paul and Arthur and Annie hated it. To Paul it became almost a demoniacal noise. The winter of their first year in the new house their father was very bad.
The children played in the street, on the brim of the wide, dark valley, until 8 o'clock. Then they went to bed. Their mother sat sewing below. Having such a great space in front of the house gave the children a feeling of night, of vastness, and of terror. This terror came in from the shrieking of the tree and the anguish of the home discord. Often Paul would wake up, after he had been asleep a long time, aware of thuds downstairs. Instantly he was wide awake. Then he heard the booming shouts of his father, come home nearly drunk, then the sharp replies of his mother, then the bang, bang of his father's fist on the table, and the nasty snarling shout as the man's voice got higher. And then the whole was drowned in a piercing medley of shrieks and cries from the great wind-swept ash-tree. The children lay silent in suspense, waiting for a lull in the wind to hear what their father was doing. He might hit their mother again. There was a feeling of horror, a kind of bristling in the darkness, and a sense of blood. They lay with their hearts in the grip of an intense anguish. The wind came through the tree fiercer and fiercer. All the chords of the great harp hummed, whistled, and shrieked. And then came the horror of the sudden silence, silence everywhere, outside and downstairs. What was it? Was it a silence of blood? What had he done? The children lay and breathed the darkness. And then at last they heard their father throw down his boots and tramp upstairs in his stockinged feet. Still they listened. Then at last, if the wind allowed, they heard the water of the tap drumming into the kettle which their mother was filling for morning, and they could go to sleep in peace. So they were happy in the morning, happy, very happy playing, dancing at night round the lonely lamp-post in the midst of the darkness. But they had one tight place of anxiety in their hearts, one darkness in their eyes, which showed all their lives. Paul hated his father. As a boy he had a fervent private religion. "Make him stop drinking," he prayed every night. "Lord, let my father die." He prayed very often. "Let him not be killed at pit." He prayed when, after tea, the father did not come home from work. That was another time when the family suffered intensely. The children came from school and had their teas. On the hob the big black saucepan was simmering. The stew jar was in the oven, ready for Morel's dinner. He was expected at 5 o'clock, but for months he would stop and drink every night on his way from work. In the winter nights, when it was cold and grew dark early, Mrs. Morel would put a brass candlestick on the table, light a tallow candle to save the gas. The children finished their bread and butter, or dripping, and were ready to go out to play. But if Morel had not come home, they faltered. The sense of his sitting in all his pit dirt, drinking, after a long day's work, not coming home and eating and washing, but sitting, getting drunk, on an empty stomach, made Mrs. Morel unable to bear herself. From her the feeling was transmitted to the other children. She never suffered alone any more. The children suffered with her. Paul went out to play with the rest. Down in the great trough of twilight, tiny clusters of lights burned where the pits were. A few last colliers straggled up the dim field path. The lamplighter came along. No more colliers came. Darkness shut down over the valley. Work was done. It was night. Then Paul ran anxiously into the kitchen. The one candle still burned on the table. The big fire glowed red. Mrs. Morel sat alone. On the hob the saucepan steamed. The dinner plate lay waiting on the table. All the room was full of the sense of waiting, waiting for the man who was sitting in his pit dirt, dinnerless, some mile away from home, across the darkness, drinking himself drunk. Paul stood in the doorway. "Has my dad come?" he asked. "You can see he hasn't," said Mrs. Morel, cross with the futility of the question. Then the boy dawdled about near his mother. They shared the same anxiety. Presently Mrs. Morel went out and strained the potatoes.
"They're ruined and black," she said, "but what do I care?"
Not many words were spoken. Paul almost hated his mother for suffering because his father did not come home from work.
"What do you bother yourself for?" he said. "If he wants to stop and get drunk, why don't you let him?" "Let him!" flashed Mrs. Morel. "You may well say, let him!"
She knew that the man who stops on the way home from work is on a quick way to ruining himself and his home. The children were yet young, and depended on the breadwinner. William gave her the sense of relief, providing her at last with someone to turn to if Morel failed, but the tense atmosphere of the room on these waiting evenings was the same. The minutes ticked by. At 6 o'clock still the cloth lay on the table, still the dinner stood waiting, still the same sense of anxiety and expectation in the room. The boy could not stand it any longer. He could not go out and play, so he ran in to Mrs. Inger, next door but one, for her to talk to him. She had no children. Her husband was good to her, but was in a shop and came home late. So when she saw the lad at the door, she called, "Come in, Paul." The two sat talking for some time, when suddenly the boy rose, saying, "Well, I'll be going and seeing if my mother wants an errand doing." He pretended to be perfectly cheerful, and did not tell his friend what ailed him. Then he ran indoors. Morel at these times came in churlish and hateful.
"This is a nice time to come home," said Mrs. Morel.
"What's it matter to you what time I come home?"
he shouted. And everybody in the house was still, because he was dangerous. He ate his food in the most brutal manner possible, and when he had done, pushed all the pots in a heap away from him, to lay his arms on the table. Then he went to sleep. Paul hated his father so. The collier's small, mean head, with its black hair slightly soiled with grey, lay on the bare arms, and the face, dirty and inflamed, with a fleshy nose and thin, paltry brows, was turned sideways, asleep with beer and weariness and nasty temper. If anyone entered suddenly, or a noise were made, the man looked up and shouted,
"I'll lay my fist about your head, I'm telling thee, if thou does not stop that clatter. Dost hear?"
And the last two words, shouted in a bullying fashion, usually at Annie, made the family writhe with hate of the man. He was shut out from all family affairs. No one told him anything. The children, alone with their mother, told her all about the day's happenings, everything. Nothing had really taken place in them until it was told to their mother. But as soon as the father came in, everything stopped. He was like the scotch in the smooth, happy machinery of the home. But he was always aware of this fall of silence on his entry, the shutting off of life, the unwelcome. But now it was gone too far to alter. He would dearly have liked the children to talk to him, but they could not. Sometimes Mrs. Morel would say, "You ought to tell your father." Paul won a prize in a competition in a child's paper. Everybody was highly jubilant. "Now you'd better tell your father when he comes in," said Mrs. Morel. "You know how he carries on and says he's never told anything." "All right," said Paul, but he would almost rather have forfeited the prize than have to tell his father. "I've won a prize in a competition, Dad," he said. Morel turned round to him. "Have you, my boy? What sort of competition?" "Oh, nothing. About famous women." "And how much is the prize, then, as you've got?" "It's a book." "Oh, indeed." "About birds." "Hmm. And that was all. Conversation was impossible between the father and any other member of the family. He was an outsider. He had denied the God in him. The only times when he entered again into the life of his own people was when he worked, and was happy at work. Sometimes, in the evening, he cobbled the boots, or mended the kettle or his pit bottle. Then he always wanted several attendants, and the children enjoyed it. They united with him in the work, in the actual doing of something, when he was his real self again. He was a good workman, dexterous, and one who, when he was in a good humour, always sang. He had whole periods, months, almost years, of friction and nasty temper. Then sometimes he was jolly again. It was nice to see him run with a piece of red-hot iron into the scullery, crying, "Out of my road! Out of my road!" Then he hammered the soft, red-glowing stuff on his iron goose, and made the shape he wanted. Or he sat absorbed for a moment, soldering. Then the children watched with joy as the metal sank suddenly molten, and was shoved about against the nose of the soldering iron, while the room was full of a scent of burnt resin and hot tin, and Morel was silent and intent for a minute. He always sang when he mended boots, because of the jolly sound of hammering, and he was rather happy when he sat putting great patches on his moleskin pit trousers, which he would often do, considering them too dirty, and the stuff too hard, for his wife to mend. But the best time for the young children was when he made fuses. Morel fetched a sheaf of long sound wheat straws from the attic. These he cleaned with his hand, till each one gleamed like a stalk of gold, after which he cut the straws into lengths of about 6 inches, leaving, if he could, a notch at the bottom of each piece. He always had a beautifully sharp knife that could cut a straw clean without hurting it. Then he set in the middle of the table a heap of gunpowder, a little pile of black grains upon the white scrubbed board. He made and trimmed the straws while Paul and Annie rifled and plugged them. Paul loved to see the black grains trickle down a crack in his palm into the mouth of the straw, peppering jollily downwards till the straw was full. Then he bunged up the mouth with a bit of soap, which he got on his thumb-nail from a pat in a saucer, and the straw was finished. "Look, Dad," he said. "That's right, my beauty," replied Morel, who was particularly lavish of endearments to his second son. Paul popped the fuse into the powder tin, ready for the morning, when Morel would take it to the pit and use it to fire a shot that would blast the coal down. Meantime Arthur, still fond of his father, would lean on the arm of Morel's chair and say, "Tell us about down pit, Daddy." This Morel loved to do. "Well, there's one little hoss, we call him Taffy," he would begin, "and he's a false un." Morel had a warm way of telling a story. He made one feel Taffy's cunning. "He's a brown un," he would answer, "and not very high. Well, he come in the stall with a rattle, and then you hear him sneeze. 'Hello, Taff,' you say, 'what art sneezing for? Been taking some snuff?' And he sneezes again. Then he slives up and shoves his head on yer, that caden. 'What's that, Taff?' you say. 'And what does he?' Arthur always asked. 'He wants a bit of bacca, my ducky.'" This story of Taffy would go on interminably, and everybody loved it. Or sometimes it was a new tale. "And what dost think, my darlin'? When I went to put my coat on at snap time, what should go running up my arm but a mouse? 'Hey, up there!' I shouts, and I were just in time to get him by the tail." "And did you kill it?" "I did, for they're a nuisance. The place is fair snide with 'em." "And what do they live on?" "The corners the 'osses drop, and they'll get in your pocket and eat your snap if you let 'em, no matter where you hang your coat. The slivin', nibbling little nuisances, for they are." These happy evenings could not take place unless Morel had some job to do, and then he always went to bed very early, often before the children. There was nothing remaining for him to stay up for, when he had finished tinkering, and had skimmed the headlines of the newspaper. And the children felt secure when their father was in bed. They lay and talked softly a while. Then they started as the lights went suddenly sprawling over the ceiling from the lamps that swung in the hands of the colliers tramping by outside, going to take the 9 o'clock shift. They listened to the voices of the men, imagined them dipping down into the dark valley. Sometimes they went to the window and watched the 3 or 4 lamps growing tinier and tinier, swaying down the fields in the blackness,
Then it was a joy to rush back to bed and cuddle closely in the warmth. Paul was a rather delicate boy, subject to bronchitis. The others were all quite strong, so this was another reason for his mother's difference in feeling for him. One day he came home at dinner-time feeling ill, but it was not a family to make any fuss. "What's the matter with you?" his mother asked sharply. "Nothing," he replied, but he ate no dinner. "If you eat no dinner, you're not going to school," she said. "Why?" he asked. "That's why." So after dinner he lay down on the sofa, on the warm chintz cushions the children loved. Then he fell into a kind of doze. That afternoon Mrs. Morel was ironing. She listened to the small restless noise the boy made in his throat as she worked. Again rose in her heart the old, almost weary feeling towards him. She had never expected him to live, and yet he had a great vitality in his young body. Perhaps it would have been a little relief to her if he had died. She always felt a mixture of anguish in her love for him. He, in his semi-conscious sleep, was vaguely aware of the clatter of the iron on the iron-stand, of the faint thud, thud on the ironing board. Once roused, he opened his eyes to see his mother standing on the hearthrug with the hot iron near her cheek, listening, as it were, to the heat. Her still face, with the mouth closed tight from suffering and disillusion and self-denial, and her nose the smallest bit on one side, and her blue eyes so young, quick, and warm, made his heart contract with love. When she was quiet, so, she looked brave and rich with life, but as if she had been done out of her rights. It hurt the boy keenly, this feeling about her that she had never had her life's fulfilment, and his own incapability to make up to her hurt him with a sense of impotence, yet made him patiently dogged inside. It was his childish aim. She spat on the iron, and a little ball of spit bounded, raced off the dark, glossy surface. Then, kneeling, she rubbed the iron on the sack lining of the hearthrug vigorously. She was warm in the ruddy firelight. Paul loved the way she crouched and put her head on one side. Her movements were light and quick. It was always a pleasure to watch her. Nothing she ever did, no movement she ever made, could have been found fault with by her children. The room was warm and full of the scent of hot linen. Later on the clergyman came and talked softly with her. Paul was laid up with an attack of bronchitis. He did not mind much. What happened, happened, and it was no good kicking against the pricks. He loved the evenings, after 8 o'clock, when the light was put out, and he could watch the fire flames spring over the darkness of the walls and ceiling, could watch huge shadows waving and tossing, till the room seemed full of men who battled silently. On retiring to bed, the father would come into the sick-room. He was always very gentle if anyone were ill, but he disturbed the atmosphere for the boy.
"Art ter asleep, my darlin'?"
Morel asked softly.
"No, is my mother comin'?"
"She's just finishin' foldin' the clothes.
"Do you want anything?"
Morel rarely theed his son.
"I don't want nothin', but how long will she be?"
"Not long, my ducky."
The father waited undecidedly on the hearthrug for a moment or two. He felt his son did not want him. Then he went to the top of the stairs and said to his wife,
"This child's askin' for thee. How long art going to be?"
"Until I've finished. Good gracious! Tell him to go to sleep."
"She says you're to go to sleep,"
the father repeated gently to Paul.
"Well, I want her to come," insisted the boy.
"He says he can't go off till you come,"
Morel called downstairs.
"Eh, dear, I shan't be long. And do stop shouting downstairs. There's the other children." Then Morel came again and crouched before the bedroom fire. He loved a fire dearly.
"She says she won't be long," he said.
He loitered about indefinitely.
The boy began to get feverish with irritation. His father's presence seemed to aggravate all his sick impatience. At last Morel, after having stood looking at his son a while, said softly, "Good night, my darling." "Good night," Paul replied, turning round in relief to be alone. Paul loved to sleep with his mother. Sleep is still most perfect, in spite of hygienists, when it is shared with a beloved. The warmth, the security and peace of soul, the utter comfort from the touch of the other, knits the sleep, so that it takes the body and soul completely in its healing. Paul lay against her and slept, and got better, whilst she, always a bad sleeper, fell later on into a profound sleep that seemed to give her faith. In convalescence he would sit up in bed, see the fluffy horses feeding at the troughs in the field, scattering their hay on the trodden yellow snow, watch the miners troop home, small black figures trailing slowly in gangs across the white field. Then the night came up in dark blue vapour from the snow. In convalescence everything was wonderful. The snowflakes, suddenly arriving on the window-pane, clung there a moment like swallows, then were gone, and a drop of water was crawling down the glass. The snowflakes whirled round the corner of the house like pigeons dashing by. Away across the valley the little black train crawled doubtfully over the great whiteness. While they were so poor, the children were delighted if they could do anything to help economically. Annie and Paul and Arthur went out early in the morning in summer, looking for mushrooms, hunting through the wet grass, from which the larks were rising, for the white-skinned, wonderful naked bodies crouched secretly in the green. And if they got half a pound they felt exceedingly happy. There was the joy of finding something, the joy of accepting something straight from the hand of nature, and the joy of contributing to the family exchequer. But the most important harvest, after gleaning for frumenty, was the blackberries. Mrs. Morel must buy fruit for puddings on the Saturdays, also she liked blackberries. So Paul and Arthur scoured the coppices and woods and old quarries, so long as a blackberry was to be found, every week-end going on their search. In that region of mining villages blackberries became a comparative rarity. But Paul hunted far and wide. He loved being out in the country, among the bushes. But he also could not bear to go home to his mother empty. That, he felt, would disappoint her, and he would have died rather. "Good gracious!" she would exclaim as the lads came in, late, and tired to death and hungry. "Wherever have you been?" "Well," replied Paul, "there wasn't any, so we went over Miss Kill's, and look here, our mother." She peeped into the basket. "Now those are fine ones," she exclaimed. "And there's over 2 pounds. Isn't there over 2 pounds?" She tried the basket. "Yes," she answered doubtfully. Then Paul fished out a little spray. He always brought her one spray, the best he could find. "Pretty," she said, in a curious tone, of a woman accepting a love token. The boy walked all day, went miles and miles, rather than own himself beaten and come home to her empty-handed. She never realized this whilst he was young. She was a woman who waited for her children to grow up, and William occupied her chiefly. But when William went to Nottingham, and was not so much at home, the mother made a companion of Paul. The latter was unconsciously jealous of his brother, and William was jealous of him. At the same time, they were good friends. End of Part A of Chapter 4. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 4, Part 2. Mrs. Morel's intimacy with her second son was more subtle and fine, perhaps not so passionate as with her eldest. It was the rule that Paul should fetch the money on Friday afternoons. The colliers of the 5 pits were paid on Fridays, but not individually. All the earnings of each stall were put down to the chief butty, as contractor, and he divided the wages again,
either in the public house or in his own home. So that the children could fetch the money, school closed early on Friday afternoons. Each of the Morrill children, William, then Annie, then Paul, had fetched the money on Friday afternoons until they themselves went to work. Paul used to set off at 3:30 with a little calico bag in his pocket. Down all the paths, women, girls, children, and men were seen trooping to the offices. These offices were quite handsome. A new red-brick building, almost like a mansion, standing in its own grounds at the end of Greenhill Lane. The waiting room was the hall, a long, bare room paved with blue brick, and having a seat all round against the wall. Here sat the colliers in their pit dirt. They had come up early. The women and children usually loitered about on the red gravel paths. Paul always examined the grass border and the big grass bank, because in it grew tiny pansies and tiny forget-me-nots. There was a sound of many voices. The women had on their Sunday hats. The girls chattered loudly. Little dogs ran here and there. The green shrubs were silent all round. Then from inside came the cry, "Spinney Park! Spinney Park!" All the folk for Spinney Park trooped inside. When it was time for Bretty to be paid, Paul went in among the crowd. The pay room was quite small. A counter went across, dividing it into half. Behind the counter stood two men, Mr. Braithwaite and his clerk, Mr. Winterbottom. Mr. Braithwaite was large, somewhat of the stern patriarch in appearance, having a rather thin white beard. He was usually muffled in an enormous silk neckerchief, and right up to the hot summer a huge fire burned in the open grate. No window was open. Sometimes in winter the air scorched the throats of the people coming in from the freshness. Mr. Winterbottom was rather small and fat, and very bald. He made remarks that were not witty, whilst his chief launched forth patriarchal admonitions against the colliers. The room was crowded with miners in their pit dirt, men who had been home and changed, and women, and one or two children, and usually a dog. Paul was quite small, so it was often his fate to be jammed behind the legs of the men, near the fire which scorched him. He knew the order of the names. They went according to stall number. "Holliday," came the ringing voice of Mr. Braithwaite. Then Mrs. Holliday stepped silently forward, was paid, and drew aside. "Bower, John Bower." A boy stepped to the counter. Mr. Braithwaite, large and irascible, glowered at him over his spectacles. "John Bower," he repeated. "It's me," said the boy. "Why, you used to have a different nose than that," said glossy Mr. Winterbottom, peering over the counter. The people tittered, thinking of John Bower senior. "How is it your father's not come?" said Mr. Braithwaite, in a large and magisterial voice. "He's badly," piped the boy. "You should tell him to keep off the drink," pronounced the great cashier. "Never mind if he puts his foot through yer," said a mocking voice from behind. All the men laughed. The large and important cashier looked down at his next sheet. "Fred Pilkington," he called, quite indifferent. Mr. Braithwaite was an important shareholder in the firm. Paul knew his turn was next but one, and his heart began to beat. He was pushed against the chimney-piece. His calves were burning, but he did not hope to get through the wall of men. "Walter Morrill," came the ringing voice. "Here," piped Paul, small and inadequate. "Morrill, Walter Morrill," the cashier repeated, his finger and thumb on the invoice, ready to pass on. Paul was suffering convulsions of self-consciousness and could not or would not shout. The backs of the men obliterated him. Then Mr. Winterbottom came to the rescue. "He's here. Where is he? Morrill's lad." The fat, red, bald little man peered round with keen eyes. He pointed to the fireplace. The colliers looked round, moved aside, and disclosed the boy. "Here he is," said Mr. Winterbottom. Paul went to the counter. £17, 11 and 5 pence. Why don't you shout up when you're called?" said Mr. Braithwaite. He banged onto the invoice a 5-pound bag of silver, and then in a delicate and pretty movement picked up a little 10-pound column of gold and plumped it beside the silver. The gold slid in a bright stream over the paper. The cashier finished counting off the money. The boy dragged the whole down the counter to Mr. Winterbottom, to whom the stoppages for rent and tools must be paid. Here he suffered again. 16 and 6, said Mr. Winterbottom. The lad was too much upset to count. He pushed forward some loose silver and half a sovereign. "How much do you think you've given me?" asked Mr. Winterbottom. The boy looked at him, but said nothing. He had not the faintest notion. "Haven't you got a tongue in your head?" Paul bit his lip and pushed forward some more silver. "Don't they teach you to count at the board school?" he asked. "Naught but algebra and French," said a collier. "And cheek and impudence," said another. Paul was keeping someone waiting. With trembling fingers he got his money into the bag and slid out. He suffered the tortures of the damned on these occasions. His relief, when he got outside and was walking along the Mansfield Road, was infinite. On the park wall the mosses were green. There were some gold and some white fowls pecking under the apple trees of an orchard. The colliers were walking home in a stream. The boy went near the wall, self-consciously. He knew many of the men, but could not recognize them in their dirt, and this was a new torture to him. When he got down to the new inn at Bretty, his father was not yet come. Mrs. Warmby, the landlady, knew him. His grandmother, Morel's mother, had been Mrs. Warmby's friend. "Your father's not come yet," said the landlady, in the peculiar half-scornful, half-patronizing voice of a woman who talks chiefly to grown men. "Sit you down." Paul sat down on the edge of the bench in the bar. Some colliers were reckoning, sharing out their money, in a corner. Others came in. They all glanced at the boy without speaking. At last Morel came, brisk, and with something of an air, even in his blackness. "Hello," he said, rather tenderly to his son. "Have you bested me? Shall you have a drink of something?" Paul and all the children were bred up fierce anti-alcoholists, and he would have suffered more in drinking a lemonade before all the men than in having a tooth drawn. The landlady looked at him de haut en bas, rather pitying, and at the same time resenting his clear, fierce morality. Paul went home, glowering. He entered the house silently. Friday was baking day, and there was usually a hot bun. His mother put it before him. Suddenly he turned on her in a fury, his eyes flashing. "I'm not going to the office any more," he said. "Why, what's the matter?" his mother asked in surprise. His sudden rages rather amused her. "I'm not going any more," he declared. "Oh, very well, tell your father so." He chewed his bun as if he hated it. I'm not going to fetch the money." "Then one of Carlin's children can go. They'd be glad enough of the sixpence," said Mrs. Morel. This sixpence was Paul's only income. It mostly went in buying birthday presents, but it was an income, and he treasured it. But "They can have it then," he said. "I don't want it." "Oh, very well," said his mother, "but you needn't bully me about it." "They're hateful and common, and hateful they are, and I'm not going any more. Mr. Braithwaite drops his H's, and Mr. Winterbottom says you was." "And is that why you won't go any more?" smiled Mrs. Morel. The boy was silent for some time. His face was pale, his eyes dark and furious. His mother moved about at her work, taking no notice of him. "They always stand in front of me so I can't get out," he said. "Well, my lad, you've only to ask them," she replied. "And then Alfred Winterbottom says, 'What do they teach you at the board school?' "They never taught him much," said Mrs. Morel. "That is a fact. Neither manners nor wit, and his cunning he was born with." So, in her own way, she soothed him. His ridiculous hypersensitiveness made her heart ache, and sometimes the fury in his eyes roused her, made her sleeping soul lift up its head a moment, surprised. "What was the cheque?" she asked. £17 11 and 5 and 16 and 6 stoppages," replied the boy. "It's a good week, and only 5 shillings stoppages for my father." So she was able to calculate how much her husband had earned, and could call him to account if he gave her short money. Morel always kept to himself the secret of the week's amount. Friday was the baking night and market night. It was the rule that Paul should stay at home and bake. He loved to stop in and draw or read. He was very fond of drawing. Annie always gallivanted on Friday nights. Arthur was enjoying himself as usual, so the boy remained alone. Mrs. Morel loved her marketing. In the tiny market-place on the top of the hill, where 4 roads, from Nottingham and Derby, Ilkeston and Mansfield meet, many stalls were erected. Brakes ran in from surrounding villages. The market-place was full of women, the streets packed with men. It was amazing to see so many men everywhere in the streets. Mrs. Morel usually quarrelled with her lace-woman, sympathised with her fruit-man, who was a gaby, but his wife was a bad 'un, laughed with the fish-man, who was a scamp, but so droll, put the linoleum-man in his place, was cold with the oddwares-man, and only went to the crockery-man when she was driven, or drawn by the cornflowers on a little dish. Then she was coldly polite. "I wondered how much that little dish was," she said. "7 to you." "Thank you." She put the dish down and walked away, but she could not leave the market-place without it. Again she went by where the pots lay coldly on the floor, and she glanced at the dish furtively, pretending not to. She was a little woman, in a bonnet and a black costume. Her bonnet was in its 3rd year. It was a great grievance to Annie. "Mother," the girl implored, "don't wear that nubbly little bonnet." "Then what else shall I wear?" replied the mother tartly. "And I'm sure it's right enough." It had started with a tip, then it had flowers, now was reduced to black lace and a bit of jet. "It looks rather come down," said Paul. "Couldn't you give it a pick-me-up?" "I'll jowl your head for impudence," said Mrs. Morel, and she tied the strings of the black bonnet valiantly under her chin. She glanced at the dish again. Both she and her enemy, the pot-man, had an uncomfortable feeling, as if there were something between them. Suddenly she shouted, "Do you want it for 5 pence?" She started. Her heart hardened, but then she stooped and took up her dish. "I'll have it," she said. "You'll do me the favour, like?" he said. "You'd better spit in it, like you do when you have something give yer." Mrs. Morel paid him the 5 pence in a cold manner. "I don't see why you give it me," she said. "You wouldn't have let me have it for 5 pence if you didn't want to." "In this flamin' scrattlin' place you may count yourself lucky if you can give your things away," he growled. "Yes, there are bad times and good," said Mrs. Morel. But she had forgiven the pot-man. They were friends. She dare now finger his pots, so she was happy. Paul was waiting for her. He loved her home-coming. She was always her best so, triumphant, tired, laden with parcels, feeling rich in spirit. He heard her quick, light step in the entry and looked up from his drawing. "Oh," she sighed, smiling at him from the doorway. "My word, you are loaded!" he exclaimed, putting down his brush. "I am," she gasped. "That brazen Annie said she'd meet me. Such a weight!" She dropped her string bag and her packages on the table. "Is the bread done?" she asked, going to the oven.
"The last one is soaking," he replied. "You needn't look, I've not forgotten it." "Oh, that potman," she said, closing the oven door. "You know what a wretch I've said he was? Well, I don't think he's quite so bad." "Don't you?" The boy was attentive to her. She took off her little black bonnet. "No, I think he can't make any money. Well, it's everybody's cry alike nowadays, and it makes him disagreeable." "It would me," said Paul. "Well, one can't wonder at it. And he let me have—how much do you think he let me have this for?" She took the dish out of its rag of newspaper and stood looking on it with joy. "Show me," said Paul. The two stood together gloating over the dish. "I love cornflowers on things," said Paul. "Yes, and I thought of the teapot you bought me." "1 and 3," said Paul. "5d." "It's not enough, mother." "No. Do you know, I fairly sneaked off with it. But I'd been extravagant, I couldn't afford any more. And he needn't have let me have it if he hadn't wanted to." "No, he needn't, need he?" said Paul, and the two comforted each other from the fear of having robbed the potman. "We can each have stewed fruit in it," said Paul. "Or custard, or a jelly," said his mother. "Or radishes and lettuce," said he. "Don't forget that bread," she said, her voice bright with glee. Paul looked in the oven, tapped the loaf on the base. "It's done," he said, giving it to her. She tapped it also. "Yes," she replied, going to unpack her bag. "Oh, and I'm a wicked, extravagant woman. I know I shall come to want." He hopped to her side eagerly to see her latest extravagance. She unfolded another lump of newspaper and disclosed some roots of pansies and of crimson daisies. "4 pennyworth," she moaned. "How cheap!" he cried. "Yes, but I couldn't afford it this week of all weeks." "But lovely!" he cried. "Aren't they?" she exclaimed, giving way to pure joy. "Paul, look at this yellow one, isn't it? And a face just like an old man." "Just!" cried Paul, stooping to sniff. "And smells that nice! But he's a bit splashed." He ran in the scullery, came back with the flannel, and carefully washed the pansy. "Now look at him now he's wet," he said. "Yes!" she exclaimed, brimful of satisfaction. The children of Scargill Street felt quite select. At the end where the Morels lived there were not many young things, so the few were more united. Boys and girls played together, the girls joining in the fights and the rough games, the boys taking part in the dancing games and rings and make-believe of the girls. Annie and Paul and Arthur loved the winter evenings, when it was not wet. They stayed indoors till the colliers were all gone home, till it was thick dark and the street would be deserted. Then they tied their scarves round their necks, for they scorned overcoats, as all the colliers' children did, and went out. The entry was very dark, and at the end the whole great night opened out in a hollow, with a little tangle of lights below where Minton Pit lay, and another far away opposite for Selby. The farthest tiny lights seemed to stretch out the darkness for ever. The children looked anxiously down the road at the one lamp-post, which stood at the end of the field path. If the little luminous space were deserted, the two boys felt genuine desolation. They stood with their hands in their pockets under the lamp, turning their backs on the night, quite miserable, watching the dark houses. Suddenly a pinafore under a short coat was seen, and a long-legged girl came flying up. "Where's Billy Pillins, and your Annie and Eddie Dankin?" "I don't know." But it did not matter so much. There were 3 now. They set up a game round the lamp-posts, till the others rushed up yelling. Then the play went fast and furious.
There was only this one lamp-post. Behind was the great scoop of darkness, as if all the night were there. In front, another wide, dark way opened over the hill brow. Occasionally somebody came out of this way and went into the field down the path. In a dozen yards the night had swallowed them. The children played on. They were brought exceedingly close together owing to their isolation. If a quarrel took place, the whole play was spoilt. Arthur was very touchy, and Billy Pillins, really Phillips, was worse. Then Paul had to side with Arthur, and on Paul's side went Alice, while Billy Pillins always had Emmy Limb and Eddie Dakin to back him up. Then the six would fight, hate with a fury of hatred, and flee home in terror. Paul never forgot, after one of these fierce internecine fights, seeing a big red moon lift itself up, slowly, between the waste road over the hilltop, steadily like a great bird, and he thought of the Bible, that the moon should be turned to blood, and the next day he made haste to be friends with Billy Pillins. And then the wild, intense games went on again under the lamp-posts, surrounded by so much darkness. Mrs. Morel, going into her parlour, would hear the children singing away, "My shoes are made of Spanish leather, my socks are made of silk. I wear a ring on every finger, I wash myself in milk." They sounded so perfectly absorbed in the game, as their voices came out of the night, that they had the feel of wild creatures singing. It stirred the mother, and she understood when they came in at 8 o'clock, ruddy, with brilliant eyes, and quick, passionate speech. They all loved the Scargill Street house for its openness, for the great scallop of the world it had in view. On summer evenings, the women would stand against the field fence, gossiping, facing the west, watching the sunsets flare quickly out, till the Derbyshire hills ridged across the crimson far away, like the black crest of a newt. In this summer season the pits never turned full time, particularly the soft coal. Mrs. Dakin, who lived next door to Mrs. Morel, going to the field fence to shake her hearthrug, would spy men coming slowly up the hill. She saw at once they were colliers. Then she waited, a tall, thin, shrew-faced woman, standing on the hill brow, almost like a menace to the poor colliers who were toiling up. It was only 11 o'clock. From the far-off wooded hills the haze that hangs like fine black crape at the back of a summer morning had not yet dissipated. The first man came to the stile. Chock, chock, went the gate under his thrust. "What, han you knocked off?" cried Mrs. Dakin. "We han, missus." "It's a pity an they let you go," she said sarcastically. "It is that," replied the man. "Nay, you know you're flig to come up again," she said. And the man went on. Mrs. Dakin, going up her yard, spied Mrs. Morel taking the ashes to the ash-pit. "I reckon Minton's knocked off, missus," she cried. "Isn't it sickening?" exclaimed Mrs. Morel in wrath. "Ha! But I just seen Jaunt Hutchby." "They might as well have saved their shoe-leather," said Mrs. Morel, and both women went indoors, disgusted. The colliers, their faces scarcely blackened, were trooping home again. Morel hated to go back. He loved the sunny morning, but he had gone to pit to work, and to be sent home again spoiled his temper. "Good gracious, at this time!" exclaimed his wife as he entered. "Can I help it, woman?" he shouted. "And I've not done half enough dinner." "Then I'll eat my bit of snap as I took with me," he bawled pathetically. He felt ignominious and sore. And the children, coming home from school, would wonder to see their father eating with his dinner the 2 thick slices of rather dry and dirty bread and butter that had been to pit and back. "What's my dad eating his snap for now?" asked Arthur. "I should ha' had it hollered at me if I didna," snorted Morel. "What a story!" exclaimed his wife. "And is it going to be wasted?" said Morel. "I'm not such an extravagant mortal as you lot,
with your waist. If I drop a bit of bread at pit, in all the dust and dirt, I pick it up and eat it."
"The mice would eat it," said Paul. "It wouldn't be wasted."
"Good bread and butter's not for mice either," said Morel. "Dirty or not dirty, I'd eat it rather than it should be wasted."
"You might leave it for the mice and pay for it out of your next pint," said Mrs. Morel.
"Oh, might I?" he exclaimed.
They were very poor that autumn. William had just gone away to London, and his mother missed his money. He sent 10 shillings once or twice, but he had many things to pay for at first. His letters came regularly once a week. He wrote a good deal to his mother, telling her all his life, how he made friends and was exchanging lessons with a Frenchman, how he enjoyed London. His mother felt again he was remaining to her just as when he was at home. She wrote to him every week her direct, rather witty letters. All day long, as she cleaned the house, she thought of him. He was in London. He would do well. Almost, he was like her knight who wore her favour in the battle. He was coming at Christmas for 5 days. There had never been such preparations. Paul and Arthur scoured the land for holly and evergreens. Annie made the pretty paper hoops in the old-fashioned way. And there was unheard-of extravagance in the larder. Mrs. Morel made a big and magnificent cake. Then, feeling queenly, she showed Paul how to blanch almonds. He skinned the long nuts reverently, counting them all, to see not one was lost. It was said that eggs whisked better in a cold place, so the boy stood in the scullery, where the temperature was nearly at freezing point, and whisked and flew in excitement to his mother as the white of egg grew stiffer and more snowy.
"Just look, mother, isn't it lovely?"
And he balanced a bit on his nose, then blew it in the air. "Now, don't waste it," said the mother. Everybody was mad with excitement. William was coming on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Morel surveyed her pantry. There was a big plum cake and a rice cake, jam tarts, lemon tarts, and mince pies, 2 enormous dishes. She was finished cooking, Spanish tarts and cheesecakes. Everywhere was decorated. The kissing bunch of berried holly, hung with bright and glittering things, spun slowly over Mrs. Morel's head as she trimmed her little tarts in the kitchen. A great fire roared. There was a scent of cooked pastry. He was due at 7 o'clock, but he would be late. The 3 children had gone to meet him. She was alone. But at 6:45 Morel came in again. Neither wife nor husband spoke. He sat in his armchair, quite awkward with excitement, and she quietly went on with her baking. Only by the careful way in which she did things could it be told how much moved she was. The clock ticked on.
"What time does he say he's coming?"
Morel asked for the 5th time.
"The train gets in at 6:30,
she replied emphatically.
"Then he'll be here at 7:10.
"Eh, bless you, it'll be hours late on the Midland," she said indifferently. But she hoped, by expecting him late, to bring him early. Morel went down the entry to look for him. Then he came back.
"Goodness, man," she said, "you're like an ill-setting hen."
"Hadn't you better be getting him summat to eat ready?" asked the father.
"There's plenty of time," she answered.
"There's not so much as I can see on,"
he answered, turning crossly in his chair. She began to clear her table. The kettle was singing. They waited and waited. Meantime, the 3 children were on the platform at Sethley Bridge, on the Midland Main Line, 2 miles from home. They waited 1 hour. A train came. He was not there. Down the line the red and green lights shone. It was very dark and very cold.
"Ask him if the London train's come,"
said Paul to Annie when they saw a man in a tip cap.
"I'm not," said Annie. "You be quiet. He might send us off."
But Paul was dying for the man to know they were expecting someone by the London train. It sounded so grand. Yet he was too much scared of broaching any man, let alone one in a peaked cap, to dare to ask. The 3 children could scarcely go into the waiting room for fear of being sent away, and for fear something should happen whilst they were off the platform. Still they waited in the dark and cold. "It's an hour and a half late," said Arthur pathetically. "Well," said Annie, "it's Christmas Eve." They all grew silent. He wasn't coming. They looked down the darkness of the railway. There was London. It seemed the uttermost of distance. They thought anything might happen if one came from London. They were all too troubled to talk. Cold and unhappy and silent, they huddled together on the platform. At last, after more than 2 hours, they saw the lights of an engine peering round, away down the darkness. A porter ran out. The children drew back with beating hearts. A great train, bound for Manchester, drew up. 2 doors opened, and from one of them, William! They flew to him. He handed parcels to them cheerily, and immediately began to explain that this great train had stopped for his sake at such a small station as Sethley Bridge. It was not booked to stop. Meanwhile, the parents were getting anxious. The table was set, the chop was cooked, everything was ready. Mrs. Morel put on her black apron. She was wearing her best dress. Then she sat, pretending to read. The minutes were a torture to her. Said Morel. "It's an hour and a half." "And those children waiting," she said. "The train canna ha' come in yet," he said. "I tell you, on Christmas Eve they're hours wrong." They were both a bit cross with each other, so gnawed with anxiety. The ash tree moaned outside in a cold, raw wind, and all that space of night from London home. Mrs. Morel suffered. The slight click of the works inside the clock irritated her. It was getting so late. It was getting unbearable. At last there was a sound of voices, and a footstep in the entry. "He's here!" cried Morel, jumping up. Then he stood back. The mother ran a few steps toward the door, and waited. There was a rush and a patter of feet. The door burst open. William was there. He dropped his Gladstone bag and took his mother in his arms. "Mater!" he said. "My boy!" she cried. And for 2 seconds, no longer, she clasped him and kissed him. Then she withdrew and said, trying to be quite normal, "But how late you are!" "Aren't I?" he cried, turning to his father. "Well, Dad!" The 2 men shook hands. "Well, my lad!" Morel's eyes were wet. "We thought tha'd never be comin'," he said. "Oh, I'd come!" exclaimed William. Then the son turned round to his mother. "But you look well," she said proudly, laughing. "Well!" he exclaimed. "I should think so, coming home!" He was a fine fellow, big, straight, and fearless-looking. He looked round at the evergreens and the kissing bunch, and the little tarts that lay in their tins on the hearth. "By Jove, mother, it's not different!" he said, as if in relief. Everybody was still for a second. Then he suddenly sprang forward, picked a tart from the hearth, and pushed it whole into his mouth. "Well, did ever you see such a parish oven?" the father exclaimed. He had brought them endless presents. Every penny he had spent on them. There was a sense of luxury overflowing in the house. For his mother there was an umbrella with gold on the pail handle. She kept it to her dying day, and would have lost anything rather than that. Everybody had something gorgeous, and besides there were pounds of unknown sweets, Turkish delight, crystallized pineapple, and such like things which, the children thought, only the splendour of London could provide. And Paul boasted of these sweets among his friends. Real pineapple cut off in slices and then turned into crystal. Fair grand." Everybody was mad with happiness in the family. Home was home, and they loved it with a passion of love, whatever the suffering had been. There were parties, there were rejoicings. People came in to see William, to see what difference London had made to him. And they all found him "such a gentleman, and such a fine fellow, my word." When he went away again, the children retired to various places to weep alone. Morel went to bed in misery, and Mrs. Morel felt as if she were numbed by some drug, as if her feelings were paralyzed. She loved him passionately. He was in the office of a lawyer connected with a large shipping firm, and at the midsummer his chief offered him a trip in the Mediterranean on one of the boats, for quite a small cost. Mrs. Morel wrote, "Go, go, my boy. You may never have a chance again, and I should love to think of you cruising there in the Mediterranean almost better than to have you at home." But William came home for his fortnight's holiday. Not even the Mediterranean, which pulled at all his young man's desire to travel, and at his poor man's wonder at the glamorous South, could take him away when he might come home. That compensated his mother for much. End of chapter.